There is not a single shooter alive who can touch me at this distance. Victor Kane said that, then set his radio down and pressed his boot heel harder into the throat of the American soldier lying beneath him. Not to kill him, to make him look directly into the eyes of the man who had already won. Down in the valley, heavy machine guns were tearing apart the assault team. Mortar rounds were walking slowly, deliberately towards soldiers with nowhere to run. 2,100 yards of violent mountain crosswind stood between Kane and any threat on Earth. He was absolutely certain of that. He was completely wrong. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this. And drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. I want to tell you about the day I finally understood what courage really looks like. It does not look like a chest full of medals. It does not sound like a man raising his voice in a briefing room. It does not smell like gunpowder or taste like adrenaline the way Hollywood wants you to believe. Sometimes, and I know this will sound strange coming from a Navy SEAL, sometimes real courage looks like a quiet woman sitting alone at a table covered in notebook paper doing math that nobody else believes will ever matter. My name is Marcus Webb, Petty Officer 2nd Class SEAL Team 6 Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Virginia Beach. And I need to be honest with you right now at the very start of this story because I owe you that honesty and I owe her that honesty. When I first met Emily Carter, I thought she was in the wrong place. I thought she was a mistake. Someone in the administrative chain had made a clerical error that ended up wearing a uniform in our unit. I was not alone in thinking that. Every man on our team thought some version of the same thing. We were wrong. Every single one of us was completely, embarrassingly, dangerously wrong. Emily arrived at our training range on a Tuesday in October. I remember because Tuesdays at Dam Neck were always brutal long-range qualification day, the kind of morning where coffee stops working and your shoulder starts reminding you of every bad decision you ever made at the range. We had been running drills since 0530. By the time she walked through that gate with her kit bag over one shoulder and a rifle case in her right hand, the sun was already high enough to make the asphalt shimmer, and every man on that range was already running on fumes and attitude. Chief Jack Donovan saw her first. I will never forget the way he stopped mid-sentence. He had been talking to Senior Chief Reeves about the wind conditions, gesturing with his hands, the way he always did when he was absolutely certain he was the smartest person within earshot. And then he just stopped. He turned his head. He looked at Emily walking across the lot. And then he looked back at us with that expression, the one that says, without a single word, "Can you believe this?" "Tell me that's the new armorer's assistant," Donovan said. Nobody answered him because nobody knew what to say. Emily walked up to Sergeant Major Holloway, the rangemaster that morning, handed him a set of orders, and shook his hand. Holloway read the papers, nodded once, and then looked up at the rest of us. "Listen up," he said. "Petty Officer 1st Class Emily Carter. She's with us now. Sniper team, Overwatch Specialist." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard on that range, and I had been standing next to a .50 caliber when it went off without ear protection. Donovan recovered first. He always did. "Overwatch Specialist," he repeated, and he said it the way you repeat something when you want everyone to know you think it is absurd. "What's your record distance, Carter?" Emily looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not smile, and she did not frown. She just looked at him with the kind of calm that I would later come to recognize as something entirely different from passivity. It was patience. There is a profound difference between those two things, and it took me a long time to understand that. 1,720 yards, she said. Clean shot, first round. In what conditions? 14-knot crosswind, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, elevation 2,200 feet. Donovan tilted his head slightly. "And you calculated all that beforehand?" "Yes." "How long did the calculation take?" Emily paused for just a moment. 40 minutes. And there it was. That was all Donovan needed. He turned to the rest of the team with his hands spread wide, as if she had just proven his point for him. 40 minutes, he said. "Gentlemen, our new Overwatch Specialist needs 40 minutes to take a shot." He said it slowly with enormous theatrical satisfaction, letting each word land like a separate insult. Because the last time any of us were downrange in a firefight, the enemy was really patient about giving us 40-minute windows. A few of the guys laughed. Not all of them, but enough. I did not laugh. I want to be clear about that. But I also did not say anything. I stood there and I kept my mouth shut, and that silence looking back now makes me just as guilty as the laughter. Emily did not respond to Donovan. She picked up her kit bag, walked to the designated shooter's position at lane 7, and began unpacking her equipment with the same quiet, unhurried focus she would bring to every single thing she did for the next 14 months. I watched her set up. I could not help it. Something about the way she moved was different from the rest of us. Every SEAL I had ever met, including myself, carried a certain kind of performed readiness, a physical language that said, at all times, I know what I am doing and I am dangerous. It was unconscious, mostly something the training beat into you until it became your resting state. Emily did not have that. She had something else, something quieter, and I would come to realize something far more lethal. She opened a notebook, not a tablet, not a digital rangefinder interface, a physical notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that you can buy at any drugstore for $2. She opened it, uncapped a pen, and began writing numbers. "What is she doing?" said Petty Officer Ramirez, who was standing beside me. "I have no idea," I said. "She's doing math," said Petty Officer Torres from the other side. "She's literally doing math before she even looks through the scope." Ramirez stared at her for a long moment. "That's either the smartest thing I've ever seen or the most insane thing I've ever seen." "Probably both," Torres said. What I did not know yet was that Emily was calculating the morning's atmospheric conditions with the kind of precision that most of us had never been trained to attempt. She was measuring wind velocity at multiple layers, not just at the firing position, but at mid-range and at the target, understanding that the wind at your shoulder and the wind at 1,000 yards downrange are often two completely different animals. She was factoring in the temperature, the humidity, the barometric pressure, the elevation, and something that most snipers never even think about at the distances we were trained to engage, the Coriolis effect, the rotation of the Earth itself. I did not learn any of that until much later. At the time, all I saw was a woman writing in a notebook while every other shooter on the line was already zeroing their optics and preparing for qualification rounds. And at the time, I filed that image in the back of my mind under a label I am now deeply ashamed of, a label that said she doesn't belong here. The first qualification shot of the morning was at 800 yards. Standard. Every qualified sniper on that range could make that shot in any reasonable conditions without dramatically elevated difficulty. The results came back. Every shooter hit. Emily hit. Clean, dead center. Donovan looked at her target with the expression of a man who had expected to find a reason to dismiss her and was irritated to be denied it. The second shot was at 1,100 yards. The wind had picked up slightly, nothing dramatic, at the 7-knot gust from the southwest. The kind of condition that adds complexity, but remains well within the capability of any experienced long-range shooter. Results came back. Most hit, 2 slightly off-center, Emily dead center. Now Donovan walked down to look at her target personally. I followed him because I was curious, and because even then, something in the back of my mind was starting to rearrange itself. He stared at the target for a long moment. Then he turned to her. "Lucky," he said. "The wind shifted 2.3 knots between the time I calculated and the time I fired," Emily said without looking up from her notebook. "I adjusted 3/4 of a mil right. The shot was not lucky." Donovan's jaw tightened. "You adjusted in the field between your calculation and your shot?" "Yes." "How fast?" "About 4 seconds." He stared at her. 4 seconds. The solution was already established. I was only updating one variable. Donovan did not say anything for a moment. I watched him working through something internally, some calculation of his own, not ballistics, but pride, deciding whether to be impressed or to find another angle of attack. He chose another angle. "Carter," he said, "combat is not a math problem. You understand that." "I understand that's what people say." "It's what people say because it's true. When you're downrange and rounds are coming in and your spotter is calling corrections and your target is moving and your hands are shaking, there is no time for notebooks. There is no time for Coriolis calculations. There is instinct and there is experience and there is absolutely nothing else." Emily looked up at him for the first time in the conversation. "With respect, chief instinct is just pattern recognition built from repeated experience. My patterns are built differently from yours. That doesn't make them wrong." And that was when I realized that Emily Carter was not passive. She was not intimidated. She was not trying to fit in or make friends or avoid conflict. She was operating on a completely different frequency from the rest of us, one where the opinions of other people simply carried less weight than the truth. And she was willing to say the truth calmly and directly to the most senior and most feared operator on our team. Donovan held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked away. "This is going to be a problem," Torres muttered beside me. He was wrong about that too. Emily Carter was not a problem. She was the solution to a problem none of us even knew we had. Over the following weeks, I watched her work with the kind of attention that I would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked. There was something almost hypnotic about her process, not in a mystical way, not in the way that phrase usually gets applied to things that are merely aesthetically pleasing. Hypnotic in the true sense, in the way that watching any genuine master work in their medium is hypnotic. It pulled at your attention. It demanded to be observed. She would arrive at the range before anyone else, not by a few minutes, by hours. She would spend the first 60 to 90 minutes of every training day observing, just watching, recording, her notebook filled with numbers that I eventually learned to partially interpret. Wine vectors, temperature gradients, humidity curves drawn across the morning, like the graphs of a heartbeat. She was reading the environment the way the rest of us read each other's body language, picking up signals that most of us were not even aware existed. And then she would shoot, and the shots were not always spectacular in the obvious way. She was not shooting at distances that made jaws drop, not in those early weeks. What she was doing was something more subtle, and to anyone paying close attention, far more impressive. She was shooting with a consistency that defied every variable we had been trained to accept as uncontrollable. Most long-range snipers, even the best ones, even men with years of downrange experience, operate within what we call a dispersion envelope. Even at moderate distances, your shots are going to spread slightly. The wind catches the bullet differently on each pass. Your breathing is never perfectly identical. The trigger break is never exactly the same. You accept that dispersion. You train to minimize it. You work to keep your group tight, but you accept that it exists. Emily's dispersion envelope was different. Not smaller across all conditions, but smarter. She was not fighting the variables. She was timing herself around them, waiting for the 1-second window where the wind layering aligned, where the thermal currents settled, where every calculable factor was briefly at its most predictable. And in that window she fired. And in that window her shots were as close to mechanically perfect as any human being I have ever seen achieve. I started arriving early. Not as early as her, but earlier than I had been coming. I told myself it was to get additional range time. That was true, but it was not the whole truth. I wanted to watch her work. I wanted to understand what I was seeing. One morning I walked up and sat down about 20 feet to her left while she was in her observation period notebook, open pen, moving steadily. She did not look up. "You're early," she said. "So are you." "I'm always early." "Yeah, I've noticed." I paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "What are you writing right now?" She did not answer immediately. The pen kept moving. After about 30 seconds, she said, "I'm recording wine velocity at 3 separate reference points. The tree line at 400 yards is my near marker. The hilltop at 1200 is my mid-range marker. The water tank at 1700 is my far marker. Each one moves differently. I'm building a wind profile for the range this morning." I thought about that. How long does that take? Depends on how stable the conditions are. Today, maybe at another 40 minutes. Yesterday was faster. And then you can calculate your solutions faster during the actual shoot. She looked at me then. It was the first time she had actually looked at me during a conversation, and I felt the weight of that attention in a way that surprised me. Her eyes were extraordinarily steady, the kind of steady that you see in people who have genuinely made peace with uncertainty. "Not just faster," she said, "more accurately. The math is only as good as the data underneath it. If you rush the observation, you corrupt the foundation. And then when the shot matters most, the calculation fails, and you're left with nothing but instinct." She said that last word the way you might say the name of a tool that you use but do not trust with your life. "Donovan says instinct is everything in a real firefight," I said. "Donovan has made that shot at 800 yards enough times that his muscles remember it," she said. "His instinct is real and it works at 800 yards in the conditions he's trained in. The question is what happens when the conditions are outside of what his muscles remember. What happens at 1200, at 1500, at 2000? She paused. Instinct is a library. It can only give you what's in the collection. Math works at distances the library has never visited. I sat with that for a long time. I did not tell Donovan about that conversation. I did not tell anyone. But I started paying closer attention, and what I began to see over the following weeks changed the architecture of something I had believed to be permanent. The ridicule did not stop. If anything, it intensified as the weeks went on because Emily never gave anyone the satisfaction of a reaction. And for certain types of men, nothing is more infuriating than a target that refuses to respond to their fire. Donovan developed a habit of narrating her preparation with running commentary delivered loudly enough for the entire team to hear. Carter's consulting her notebook, he would say. Emily's asking the wind for permission. Our mathematician is calculating whether this bullet believes in gravity. The guys laughed. Some of them laughed because they thought he was funny. Some of them laughed because they were afraid not to. A few of them, I think, laughed because it was easier than examining what they actually thought. She never responded. She never looked up with anger in her eyes, never tightened her jaw in that visible way that people do when they are working to contain a reaction. She just kept writing, kept observing, kept building the foundation of something none of us could yet see. Then came the morning of the long-range advanced qualification, the one that only a handful of people in the entire naval special warfare community attempt and few are complete. The target was set at 2,000 yards. Not 2,000 yards in ideal conditions, 2,000 yards on a day when the Virginia coast was throwing everything it had at the range. A storm system off the Atlantic had the wind churning and shifting, gusting from 14 to 23 knots with no predictable pattern, the temperature dropping steadily, and a humidity level that was doing genuinely unpleasant things to the ballistic coefficient of any round we could put in a chamber. The senior instructor, man named Chief Warrant Officer Briggs, who had more long-range kills to his name than any of us were comfortable thinking about, stood in front of the assembled team and looked out at those conditions. Anyone who wants to withdraw from this qualification is welcome to do so without penalty, he said. The conditions are outside parameters for a meaningful test. 2 men withdrew immediately. Donovan considered it. I could see him weighing his pride against his judgment, and for a moment I thought his judgment would win. It did not. I'll shoot, he said. I said I would shoot. Torres said he would shoot. Ramirez. 3 others? And Emily, who had not been looking at any of us, who had been looking out at the range with her pen moving in her notebook, said quietly without raising her hand, I'll shoot. Donovan looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has just been told that this will be entertaining. We shot in sequence. Donovan went first because he was the senior man and because he believed in the power of setting the standard early. He fired. At 2,000 yards in those conditions, it was genuinely heroic that the round landed within 6 feet of the target. That is not mockery, that is reality. 2,000 yards in a 20-knot shifting crosswind is the kind of distance that reduces the finest instincts in the world to probability. Donovan hit the berm, close, not close enough. I fired and hit nothing I am proud of admitting to. Torres, Ramirez, the others. The pattern was consistent brave shots, professional fundamentals, results that reflected honestly what those conditions were doing to the physics. Emily went last. She had been writing in her notebook for the previous 45 minutes. I had been watching her peripherally the entire time, tracking the way the pen moved, the way she paused periodically to look out at specific points on the range, the way she tilted her head slightly when the gusts changed direction. She had built something in those pages. I did not know what it was yet. She settled into position. She adjusted her scope. She opened her notebook to a specific page, studied it for about 20 seconds, and then closed it and set it aside. She was still for a very long time, longer than any of us. Donovan made a sound that was not quite a word. Briggs silenced him with a look. The wind was impossible. It changed direction 3 times in the 90 seconds she was lying there. It gusted. It died. It gusted again from a completely different quarter. It was the kind of variable that should have made the shot impossible, not difficult, not challenging, but physically, mathematically impossible, because you cannot aim at a moving wind unless you understand the wind well enough to know when it is about to hold still. She fired. 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The round traveled 2,000 yards through air that had been fighting everything we sent into it all morning. It hit the target, not near the target, not within a foot of the target, dead center, within 3 inches of absolute center on a man-sized target at 2,000 yards in a variable 23-knot crosswind at declining temperature at humidity savant that had been defeating every other round we fired. The range went silent. Briggs walked forward and looked at the target. He stood there for a long time. Then he came back and he looked at Emily and he said very quietly, "How?" And Emily said also quietly, "There was a 2.4-second window when the near wind layer and the mid-range layer aligned in the same direction. I had been tracking the pattern for 45 minutes. I knew it was coming." Briggs stared at her. "You waited for a specific window?" "Yes." "You calculated the timing of the window?" "Approximately, within a margin of about 3 seconds. I could have been wrong." "But you weren't." "No." He nodded very slowly. Then he wrote something in his own notebook, capped his pen, and said in a voice loud enough for the whole team, "That is the finest long-range shot I have witnessed in 22 years of range duty." Nobody said anything. I looked at Donovan. He was looking at Emily's target. His face was doing something complicated, something between disbelief and the beginning of something he was not ready to admit to yet. His jaw was set. His eyes were narrower than usual. He did not say she was lucky. Not that time, but he also did not say anything else. He picked up his kit and he walked off the line, and for the rest of that day, he was quieter than I had ever seen him. I stayed after everyone else left. Emily was cleaning her rifle with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, breaking it down, component by component, inspecting each surface, reassembling it in a sequence she had clearly practiced until it was automatic. Her notebook was on the bench beside her rifle case. "Can I see it?" I asked, nodding at the notebook. She looked at me for a moment, then she slid it toward me. I opened it. The pages were dense with numbers and notation, wind vectors, temperature curves, equations recognized in fragments, and others I could not parse at all. There were small diagrams, time markers in the margins, arrows indicating direction shifts. At the bottom of the page she had been working on during the qualification, there was a single circled notation, 2.4, SEC window, fire on 0. She had written it down before she fired. She had known within a margin of 3 seconds exactly when the conditions would align. I closed the notebook and slid it back. "This took 45 minutes to build," I said. "Yes." "What if you only had 10 minutes? She thought about that, and the fact that she thought about it honestly rather than dismissing the question told me something important about who she was. I could build a partial solution in 10 minutes. Enough to work with in most conditions. But partial means more uncertainty at the margins. At moderate range, the uncertainty is acceptable. At extreme range, it could mean the difference between the shot landing and the shot missing. And what's extreme range for you? She considered. Anything past about 1,400 yards where conditions are active. Past that, the variables compound. Every additional 100 yards you add is not a linear increase in difficulty. It's exponential. What's your absolute limit? She looked at me with those steady eyes. I haven't found it yet. I thought about that on my drive home. I thought about it while I was making dinner. I thought about it in the dark, staring at the ceiling, with the memory of that round landing dead center at 2,000 yards, playing on a loop behind my eyes. Donovan's instinct had reached its limit that morning. I had watched it happen in real time. His fundamentals were perfect. His experience was real. His courage was absolute. And none of it had been enough to make that shot in those conditions. Emily had made the shot with math, not instead of fundamentals, not instead of courage. Math in addition to those things. Math as the foundation that the other skills were built on top of. Math is the thing that made the impossible merely very, very difficult. I was not the only one who noticed the change in the atmosphere after that day. Torres stopped laughing at her notebook. Ramirez started asking her questions, not a lot of them, but careful ones, the kind you ask when you are genuinely trying to understand something. Even some of the guys who had been the most enthusiastic audience for Donovan's commentary began finding reasons to stand near her during her observation periods, watching the pen move across the page with the expression of men who were seeing something familiar from a completely different angle. Donovan did not change. Not visibly, not yet. He still made his comments, still maintained the performance of casual dismissal. But I noticed, and I think Emily noticed, though she would never have said, so that the comments came less frequently and that the laughter they produced was thinner each time. She was not winning the argument. She was not making speeches or defending herself or fighting back in any of the ways that most of us would have fought. She was just continuing, day after day, early morning after early morning. The notebook filled. Another one started. The shots landed where only the math said they would land. And slowly, in the way that undeniable evidence always eventually works on anyone honest enough to receive it, the truth of what she was doing was finding its way through the armor that most of us wore against ideas that threatened what we already believed. I did not know yet that those months of watching her work would someday be the reason I was alive to tell this story. I did not know that the 2.4-second window she had found on a Virginia range would be the preview of something none of us could have imagined waiting for us in a mountain canyon on the other side of the world. All I knew that evening driving home in the early dark of October was that I had been wrong about Emily Carter, comprehensively and embarrassingly wrong, and that whatever she was building in those notebooks, whatever that patient, meticulous, painstaking collection of truth was leading toward, I wanted to be paying attention when it arrived, because some people prepare for the shot they are going to take. Emily Carter was preparing for the shot nobody else believed was possible, and she had already decided she was going to take it. 3 weeks after the qualification shot that had silenced every man on that range, the team received orders that changed everything. Marcus Webb was in the armory when Donovan walked in with the mission folder. Not a briefing packet, not a preliminary assessment document. A full mission folder sealed with the kind of classification markings that made your stomach tighten before you even opened the cover. Donovan set it on the table and looked around at the assembled team with an expression Marcus had not seen on him before. Not excitement, not the usual pre-mission energy that most operators carried like a second skin. Something heavier, something that looked, if Marcus was being completely honest with himself, like controlled concern. Eastern Europe, Donovan said. Mountain region. I'll give you the full brief in 20 minutes. What I'll tell you right now is that this one is not standard. Nobody asked questions. That was the culture. You waited for the brief. But Marcus watched the men around him processing those two words, Eastern Europe, not standard, and he could read the adjustment happening in real time. Shoulders settling differently, jaws setting. The particular kind of quiet that descends on professionals when they understand that whatever comes next is going to require everything they have. Emily was at the far end of the table. She had a notebook open in front of her. Always the notebook, always the pen moving. And when Donovan said the words Eastern Europe, her pen stopped. Just for a moment. Then it resumed. But Marcus had been watching her long enough to know what that pause meant. She already knew something about what was in that folder, or she knew something about what Eastern Europe meant in the current operational climate. Either way, she had registered it, processed it, and returned to work. That was Emily Carter in 2 seconds. 2. The briefing room was cold, the way briefing rooms always were. The air conditioning set about 10 degrees too low, as if someone in the Navy had decided long ago that operators perform better when slightly uncomfortable. Holloway ran the first portion, maps, terrain analysis, atmospheric data for the region that made several experienced men in the room shift in their seats, because mountain environments in that part of the world were notoriously unforgiving. Altitude variance, temperature inversion, layers, crosswinds that behaved like living things, unpredictable and vindictive. Then came the target, Victor Kane. Marcus had heard the name before in the peripheral way that you hear names that float through the intelligence community without ever landing squarely in your field of concern. Kane was former military Army, Special Forces, 3 combat deployments, a career that had ended somewhere between an honorable discharge and something that the official record was deliberately vague about. After leaving service, he had spent 5 years building himself into something else entirely. A contractor, an organizer, a man who had learned during his time in uniform exactly how the machinery of American military power operated and had decided that knowledge was more valuable sold to the wrong people than applied to the right mission. What Kane had now, what made him the kind of target that generated a mission folder with those classification markings, was a fortified compound in the mountains of a country that Marcus was not going to name in this story, protecting a stockpile of stolen chemical weapons that had been traced through 3 different intelligence networks across 14 months of painstaking surveillance work. The weapons were real, the threat was real, and Kane, having grown up inside the American military system, had designed his compound specifically to defeat the strategies that system would use to come after him. The compound sits at the top of a ridgeline, Holloway said, clicking to a terrain diagram. Primary approach routes are all covered. He has machine gun positions at the three most likely infiltration vectors. Mortar crew on the north face. What he doesn't have, because he didn't think he'd need it, is adequate anti-air. So we have drone surveillance capability. But drone strikes are off the table because of the chemical storage. An explosion at the wrong location risks dispersal. What's the assault plan? Donovan asked. Alpha Team infiltrates on foot from the southwest approach using a dry riverbed for concealment to within 400 yards of the perimeter wire. Breach and clear the main structure. Extract with or without Kane. The primary objective is confirmation of the weapons cache location and disabling the distribution network. With or without Kane, Torres repeated. Ideally with Kane breathing, Holloway said. Intel value. But the mission succeeds either way. An Overwatch, Donovan asked, with the careful neutrality of a man who already suspected the answer and was not going to enjoy it. Holloway brought up the terrain map again and pointed to a position on the opposite side of a canyon that to Marcus looked approximately like standing on one edge of the Grand Canyon and being asked to provide covering fire for someone on the other side. 2,100 yards, Holloway said. Across the canyon, it's the only position with adequate sight lines to the compound's exterior in the approach corridor. The room was quiet for a moment. 2,100 yards, Donovan said, in mountain crosswinds. Yes. That's not an engagement range. That's an observation range. He paused. That's reconnaissance. That is correct. The Overwatch team's primary mission designation is reconnaissance. Eyes on the compound, real-time updates to the assault team. The engagement role is classified as secondary and contingency only. Marcus understood what that meant in operational language. It meant that 2,100 yards across a canyon in mountain wind conditions was a distance that no one in the planning chain had seriously intended the Overwatch team to shoot across. It was there on paper as a contingency because military planning required contingencies. But the real expectation was eyes and comms, nothing more. He looked at Emily. She was studying the terrain map with an expression he had come to recognize over the previous months, not concern, not the performative intensity that some operators brought to threat assessment. Pure attention, the kind of focus that meant she was already building something, already measuring variables that nobody else in the room was thinking about yet. After the briefing, as the team dispersed to begin mission preparation, Marcus fell into step beside her in the corridor. 2,100 yards, he said. Yes, she said. Across a canyon, mountain environment. Yes. Wind conditions in that region at that elevation are going to be brutal. She stopped walking, turned to face him. I know. Emily, he lowered his voice. That's not a shot anyone is expecting us to make. It's a reconnaissance post. We go up there, we watch, we call the action for Alpha Team. That's it. She looked at him with those steady eyes, and what he saw in them was not recklessness, not bravado, not the dangerous overconfidence that got operators killed. It was something quieter and more serious. It was the expression of someone who had been calculating distances that nobody else was willing to calculate for months for exactly this kind of moment. I know what the mission designation says, Marcus, she said. And then she walked away and he stood in the corridor for a long moment, understanding that Emily Carter was already preparing for the contingency that everyone else in the planning chain had included on paper and dismissed in reality. She spent the next 4 days in a way that Marcus had come to recognize as her version of pre-mission preparation, which bore essentially no resemblance to how any other operator prepared. While the Alpha Team ran close quarters combat drills and rehearsed the breach sequence and checked and rechecked their kit, Emily sat with atmospheric data she had requested and somehow obtained through channels Marcus could not trace detailed meteorological records for the mountain region spanning the previous 7 years. Wind pattern and analysis, temperature inversion frequency, seasonal thermal current behavior at the relevant altitude range. She was not preparing to observe. She was preparing to shoot, Torres noticed. She's building a firing solution, he told Marcus on the second day of prep. Not a recon package, a firing solution for 2,100 yards in mountain conditions. I know, Marcus said. Does Donovan know? Marcus thought about that. I think Donovan knows and has decided not to think about it. Torres was quiet for a moment. Should we say something? What would we say? She's doing preparation. Nobody can tell her what to prepare for. Marcus, Torres turned to face him, 2,100 yards in active mountain crosswind. That's not a real shot. That's a number. That's a distance that exists in theory. That's what we said about 2,000 yards on the qualification range, Marcus said. And he walked away before Torres could answer because he did not have an answer himself, and he was not ready to pretend that he did. Donovan confronted her on the third day. Marcus was not present for the conversation, but he heard about it from Reeves, who had been close enough to catch most of it. Donovan had walked into the planning space where Emily was working and stood over her table for a moment, looking at the spread of atmospheric charts and ballistic data she had assembled. "Carter," he said. She looked up. "What are you building?" "Environmental profile," she said. "Wind pattern analysis for the operational area, thermal current behavior at elevation, temperature variance across the day-night cycle. For reconnaissance purposes," a pause. "For complete situational awareness." Donovan sat down across from her. Reeves said this was unusual enough, Donovan sitting voluntarily across from Emily Carter, that it made him stop pretending to work and start actually listening. "Let me be direct with you," Donovan said, and his voice had a different quality than usual. Not the theater of his public dismissals. Something quieter. Something that might have been, if you were being generous, a species of genuine concern. 2,100 yards across a canyon in mountain wind. "I've been doing this for 17 years. I've made shots that most people in this community would call impossible. I'm telling you, not as a challenge, not as a put-down. I am telling you as a professional that distance in those conditions is outside the practical engagement envelope of any human shooter. Any equipment, any calculation, any preparation." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your longest confirmed engagement?" Donovan paused. 1,480 yards. "What were the conditions?" Another pause, slightly longer. "Moderate crosswind, stable temperature, sea level elevation." "So controlled conditions at 1480, she said, not cruelly, not triumphantly, just stating data. "In a mountain environment at 2,100 yards, the compounding variables are—" "I know what the compounding variables are, Carter." "Then you know the calculation is significantly more complex, not impossible." Donovan leaned forward slightly. "There's a difference between a calculation that works on paper and a shot that works in combat. You know what happens if you miss at that distance? In a live engagement, you've given away your position. You've spent the one moment where the target was exposed, and you've done nothing but make the situation on the ground worse." Emily held his gaze. "And you know what happens if we don't have a shot when the mission needs one? If Alpha Team walks into something and there is no engagement capability within range." She paused. "I'm not planning to miss, Chief." Reeves told Marcus later that Donovan had sat there for about 10 seconds, which on Donovan's personal clock of emotional display was the equivalent of a very long speech. Then he had said, "Just make sure your recon duties are not compromised by whatever else you're planning," and stood up and left. Emily went back to her data. The night before deployment, Marcus found her alone in the equipment room. Her rifle laid out on a clean cloth, every component inspected with the systematic care he had come to think of as her signature. The notebook was open beside the rifle. She was writing something in the margins of a page dense with numbers. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I will," she said without looking up. "Emily," he sat down on the bench nearby. "I'm going to ask you something and I want you to tell me the truth." She looked up. "Do you actually believe you can make that shot, not in training, not on a qualification range in Virginia, in live conditions, in that terrain, with those wind variables? Do you genuinely believe it?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe that if the conditions align within a calculable window, and if I have adequate time to build a solution, and if the fundamentals of the shot are sound, then yes, the physics supports it, the math supports it. Whether the conditions will cooperate is a variable I cannot control." She paused. "But that's always been true. Every shot has variables you can't fully control. The preparation is what gives you the margin. And if the conditions don't cooperate, then I miss and we deal with that outcome." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not reckless, Marcus. I'm not going to take a shot that compromises Alpha Team's position if I don't have a real solution. I know the difference between a solution and a gamble." He believed her. That was the thing, he believed her completely, and he was not sure when that had happened, At what specific moment the belief had arrived and replaced the doubt that had been there for so long. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she repeated, and went back to writing. They deployed 2 days later. The transit was long and cold and involved 3 different transport configurations that Marcus was not going to describe in detail because the route itself was sensitive in ways that still mattered. What he would say was that by the time they were in position, Alpha Team moving toward their insertion point, and Emily and Marcus climbing toward the Overwatch position on the far ridge, the mountain was behaving exactly as her atmospheric data had predicted it would, which meant it was behaving terribly. The wind at the ridge position was not the steady, manageable crosswind that challenging training scenarios involved. It was layered, a phenomenon specific to canyon environments at altitude where the air at different heights moved in different directions and at different speeds simultaneously. At ground level, the wind came from the southwest at approximately 12 knots. 20 feet up, Marcus could see the tree line bending under something coming from the north. Above that, the clouds were moving east, pushed by something neither of them could feel from the surface. 3 separate wind layers, Emily said when they reached the Overwatch position, and she began her initial observation. She was already writing, pen moving, numbers filling the page. "Yeah," Marcus said, because there was nothing more useful to add. "This is going to take time." He set up the spotting scope and began the reconnaissance duties that were their primary mission assignment. Below at the compound, he could see the activity that the drone surveillance had been tracking, guards rotating on a schedule that had been analyzed and mapped before deployment vehicle movements at the main gate, the specific building where intelligence assessed the chemical storage to be located. And he could see Victor Kane. Not constantly, not obviously. Kane was careful in the way that people are careful when they understand specifically that they might be observed by people with the professional intent and capability to harm them. He moved through the compound, using covered routes wherever possible. He spent time in the main building rather than exposed positions. But he emerged, briefly in patterns that were unpredictable individually, but over time suggested a routine. Emily was building her profile. Marcus was calling updates to Alpha Team on the encrypted channel movement, patterns, guard rotations, vehicle positions, anything that gave Donovan's team better situational awareness as they made their slow, careful approach through the riverbed. 2 hours into their observation period, Emily showed him the notebook. The page was dense in a way he had not seen before, not just numbers, but a kind of notation system she had developed that compressed information into a spatial diagram of the canyon's wind behavior. 3 horizontal lines, each with directional arrows and velocity figures, each with timestamp variance notations. Below the diagram, a series of equations that he could only partially follow. At the bottom, a single calculation with a circle around it. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the circled figure. "Firing solution," she said, "for a target at the compound's main exterior position. If Kane presents at that location." He looked at the figure. Then he looked at the canyon between them and the compound, at the 2,100 yards of open mountain air that the bullet would have to cross through 3 different wind layers moving in 3 different directions. "Emily," he said very quietly, "it's a valid solution, Marcus. I've checked it 4 times. I'm not questioning the math," he paused. "I'm questioning the window. How long do you have when the layers align?" She was quiet for a moment. "Based on the patterns I've observed over the last 2 hours, approximately 2 to 3 seconds, maximum." He absorbed that, 2 to 3 seconds. In a live combat environment with a target that was not going to stand still, with conditions that could shift unpredictably, with the life of an entire assault team potentially depending on the outcome. And if the window doesn't come, then it doesn't come. We watch, we call, Alpha Team does their job. She met his eyes. "I don't manufacture windows, Marcus. I wait for them." The update from Alpha Team came in at hour 3 of their observation. Donovan's voice on the encrypted channel, steady and professional as always, but with an undercurrent that Marcus had learned to read after years of working with the man. They were in position. They were ready to move on his signal. The rotation gap at the south entrance would be 14 minutes in duration, beginning in approximately 22 minutes. "Overwatch confirmed sights to primary approach corridor," Donovan said. "Confirm," Marcus said. "South entrance clear, 1 guard at the east corner. Position your breach team 20 meters left of the..." And then everything changed. The explosion did not come from the compound. It came from the riverbed, the insertion route that Alpha Team had been using, the dry corridor that intelligence had assessed as unmonitored. The sound reached their position about 4 seconds after the flash. Massive, not a grenade, not a mortar. Something pre-positioned, something that had been waiting. Marcus's blood went cold. Alpha report status, he said, already knowing from the sound that the report was not going to be good. 3 seconds of static. Then Donovan's voice, and something in it that Marcus had never heard before in all the years he had known the man. Something stripped of the control, the authority, the theatrical certainty. Something raw. Ambush. We're in contact. Multiple positions. Marcus, they were waiting for us. They knew the route. The implications of that landed like a physical blow. They knew the route. Kane had known. Either the intelligence had been compromised or, and this was the thought that followed immediately, devastating in its clarity, Kane had prepared multiple ambush positions along every viable approach. Because a man who had spent years inside the American military planning system knew that there were only so many viable approach routes in a terrain like this, and he had covered them all. Marcus was already up, repositioning to get a direct sight line to the area of contact below. He could see muzzle flashes. He could see the heavy machine gun positions that were now active, sweeping the riverbed where Alpha Team was pinned. He could see the mortar crew on the north face beginning to walk rounds toward the sound of the contact. He keyed the channel. Alpha, I have visual on 2 heavy machine gun positions and 1 mortar crew. Can you move to? We can't move. Donovan cut through. His voice was tight, controlled, but barely. We've got 2 men down. We're behind a collapsed wall section, and we cannot move without exposing to the MG positions. What is your A burst of static? What is your engagement capability from Overwatch? Marcus turned to Emily. She was already behind the rifle. The notebook was open. She was writing with one hand and keeping her eye on the canyon with the other. And her face had the expression of a person who had been preparing for exactly this moment for 14 months and understood with complete clarity what it required. Tell him I need 6 minutes, she said. 6 minutes. Marcus stared at her. 5 if the wind cooperates. 6 to be certain. She did not look up. Tell him. He keyed the channel. Alpha Overwatch is building a firing solution. 6 minutes. Hold your position. A pause, then Donovan's voice, and the disbelief in it was genuine, not theatrical. Marcus, say again your engagement range. 2,100 yards. Emily's building the solution. The silence on the channel lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Donovan said, copy, 6 minutes. We'll hold. And Marcus understood what those 3 seconds of silence had contained. A man who had spent months dismissing the mathematics, who had publicly and repeatedly argued that instinct and experience were the only currencies that mattered, making the decision to trust in something he did not fully understand because the alternative was calling an airstrike on his own position and accepting that some of his men might not survive even that. Donovan had chosen Emily's math over his own certainty. That was the moment. That was the thing that Marcus would carry for the rest of his life. He turned back to the spotting scope and began calling data wind velocity at visible reference points, temperature updates, target activity at the compound exterior guard positions, anything that fed into what Emily was building. He watched the pen move. He watched the equations accumulate at the bottom of the page. He watched her stillness, the extraordinary quality of stillness that she carried into the moments that mattered most, as if the chaos of everything around her was simply noise that her system had learned to filter. Visual on Kane, Marcus said suddenly, and his voice came out tighter than he intended. Emily did not move. Location. Main exterior position, east side of the compound. He's watching the contact. Marcus adjusted the spotting scope and felt something cold in his chest. Victor Kane was standing at the edge of a covered walkway elevated above the main courtyard, looking out toward the canyon with the relaxed posture of a man watching a sporting event. He had a radio in one hand. He was directing the fight from a position he considered absolutely safe. He's exposed, partial cover to his right, but the left side and center of mass are clear. Distance variance from primary solution reference point. Marcus checked his rangefinder. Approximately 40 yards closer, adjust left, I'd say. I have it, she said quietly. Stay on him. Call his movement. He's stationary, standing, looking toward the contact. Marcus's heart was doing something he had not felt since his first deployment. Not fear exactly, Something larger and more complicated, the knowledge that in the next few minutes, the lives of every man in that riverbed below them were going to depend on a shot that every experienced professional in their community had declared impossible, being taken by a woman that those same professionals had spent 14 months telling did not belong. Emily, he's looking right at the canyon, right at us. He doesn't think anyone can touch him from this range, she said. And there was something in her voice, not anger, not triumph, just the quiet recognition of a fact. That's his mistake. 2 minutes passed. Below, the sound of the contact was intensifying, the machine guns maintaining suppressing fire, the mortar rounds walking closer to the Alpha team position, Donovan's team exhausting their ability to sustain the engagement without taking additional casualties. Marcus called position updates every 30 seconds. Kane remained at his elevated position, directing, confident, completely certain that 2,100 yards of mountain air was better protection than any physical barrier he could have built. At 4 minutes, Emily said, "I have the solution." Marcus looked at her. "What's the window?" "The near layer and the mid layer are cycling into alignment every 68 to 72 seconds. When they align, I have a clean path through the first 1,200 yards. The far layer is coming from the northwest. It's been consistent at 8 knots for the last 20 minutes. She looked up briefly. If that consistency holds, the compounding drift at extreme range is calculable. I have the correction. And if the far layer shifts, then the round drifts right by approximately 40 inches at impact and misses. She said it plainly, not as a catastrophe, as a variable. I don't think it will shift. The pattern has been stable. You don't think, Marcus said. I know as much as the data allows me to know. Beyond that, I'm doing what everyone does, making the best decision available with incomplete information. She paused. But my information is more complete than it would be for anyone else on this ridge. That's all I can offer. He thought about Donovan in that riverbed. He thought about the 2 men who were down. He thought about the mortar rounds getting closer. Kane is still exposed, Marcus said. He's not moving. I know. Emily settled fully behind the rifle. Her breathing changed, not dramatically, not in the way that movies portray the sniper composing themselves for the critical shot. Just a small, deliberate adjustment, the way you might adjust a chair before sitting down to work. Call the alignment when you see it at the tree line reference point. Marcus moved to the spotting scope and found the tree line at 400 yards, his near reference, the first visible indicator of when the lower wind layer aligned with the pattern Emily had been tracking. He watched the branches. He watched the movement of the leaves, the specific oscillation that indicated direction and velocity. He watched the pattern that had been cycling every 68 to 72 seconds for the last 20 minutes. The branches settled. Alignment, he said. Emily fired. The sound of the shot from a .338 Lapua at distance was always different from what people expected. Not the cinematic thunder of action films, but a sharp, contained report followed by a specific quality of silence. The silence of something irreversible having been set in motion. The round was in the air. 3 seconds. The distance was real, and 3 seconds was the time it required to cover it. Marcus stayed on Kane through the spotting scope. 1 second, 2 seconds. He heard Donovan's voice on the channel, distant and compressed by the encryption, asking for a status update. And he could not answer because his entire consciousness was compressed into the circle of the spotting scope and the figure of Victor Kane standing at the edge of the elevated walkway, looking out at the canyon, certain in his safety. 3 seconds. Victor Kane dropped. Not dramatically, not in the way of film. He simply went from standing to not standing with the instantaneous quality of a light being switched off. One moment present, the next absent, and the walkway was empty, and the radio he had been holding clattered somewhere below, out of sight, and Marcus was still staring at the empty space where the man had been when his voice finally reconnected with the rest of him. Hit, Marcus said. Kane is down. The silence on the channel lasted long enough that Marcus had a moment of absolute terror that the radio was broken. Then Donovan's voice. And what Marcus would remember for the rest of his life was not what Donovan said, but the sound underneath the words, something fractured and unguarded and completely human. Say again, Overwatch. Victor Kane is down, Marcus said. Single shot, he's down. Below the compound, the immediate effect was visible even at their distance. The machine gun on the north position ceased firing, not strategically, not in response to a command, but with the sudden vacuum quality of a machine losing its operator. The mortar crew disappeared from the north face. The coordinated rhythm of the compound's defense, which had been the product of one man's direction and one man's certainty, collapsed into something disorganized and desperate. Marcus watched it happen and could not speak for a full 30 seconds. Then he keyed the channel. Alpha MG North is silent. Mortar crew has abandoned position. South MG still active, but crew appears uncoordinated. This is your window. Donovan's voice came back and the control was returning to it, the professional frequency reasserting itself over the rawness. Copy that, Overwatch. Moving. Marcus set down the channel handset and looked at Emily. She was still behind the rifle. She had not moved from her position. She was doing what she always did after a shot, maintaining her position, maintaining her scope. Picture, cataloging the outcome with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. He could not read her face from his angle, but he could see her breathing slow, steady, the breathing of someone who had done the work and trusted the work and was now simply acknowledging what the work had produced. Emily, he said. She moved back from the rifle. She looked at him. Her eyes were the same as always, steady, focused, carrying the particular quality of calm that he had spent 14 months trying to understand and had finally in these last few minutes recognized for what it truly was. It was not the calm of someone who did not feel the weight of what they had done. It was the calm of someone who had decided long ago that the weight was acceptable, that the preparation was the answer to the weight, that if you did the work, all of it, every variable, every early morning, every page of every notebook, then when the moment came, you could bear what it required. Good shot, Marcus said, and it was the most inadequate thing he had ever said, and it was also the only thing there was to say. Emily nodded once. She picked up her pen. She opened the notebook, and she began recording the outcome with the same meticulous attention that she had given the preparation. In the riverbed below, Donovan's team was moving. In the compound, the coordinated defense had become a panic. And 2,100 yards across a mountain canyon with 3 wind layers and an impossible distance between the rifle and the target, Emily Carter had written another number in her notebook. The one that nobody else had believed could exist. The radio crackled again 40 seconds after Marcus called the hit, and what came through was not Donovan's voice. It was Torres, and Torres was not a man who panicked. Marcus had seen him take a round through the shoulder in a contact outside Mosul and continue calling corrections for 11 minutes before he acknowledged he was hit. So when Torres's voice came through the channel with that specific quality of compressed urgency, Marcus felt it in his sternum before he processed it with his brain. Overwatch, we have a problem. The South MG is back up and they've repositioned. We cannot move. Repeat, we cannot move it to the window. Donovan is hit. Marcus's hand tightened on the radio handset so hard his knuckles went white. Say again, Donovan is hit. Fragmentation, left side, he's conscious and he's angry about it, which means he's okay for now, but we are pinned behind this wall and the window you called is closing. A burst of static. We need another window, Overwatch. How fast can you give us another window? Marcus looked at Emily. She was already back behind the rifle. She had not waited for him to relay the information. She had been monitoring the channel with one ear and the spotting scope with the other, and she was already reassessing, already rebuilding, already doing what nobody else in their position could have done. The MG repositioned to the southeast corner, she said without looking up. They're anticipating Alpha Team's movement vector. Whoever is running that crew is thinking tactically. Can you take the crew? The crew is partially covered. I have a sight window on the gun position itself. Approximately 40% of the weapon is exposed. If I hit the weapon, it disables without requiring a direct hit on personnel. Marcus stared at her. You're talking about hitting a heavy machine gun at 2,000 yards. 1,080 yards to the new position. The weapon's receiver is approximately 18 inches wide. She paused. The solution from Kane's shot gives me a solid baseline. Wine layers are holding within acceptable variance. Yes, I can hit it. The math of what she was describing was almost too much to process in real time. She was proposing to hit an 18-inch target at 2,080 yards with round-trip travel time of almost exactly 3 seconds, using a baseline solution built for a different target at a slightly different range, with wind layers that had been stable, but were under no obligation to remain so. It was the kind of shot that, described in a briefing, would cause experienced officers to clear their throats and change the subject. Do it, Marcus said. She fired 11 seconds later. The round traveled. Marcus had his spotting scope on the machine gun position, and he saw the impact not on the crew but on the weapon itself, the barrel assembly taking the hit, and the entire gun jerking violently to the right on its mount. The crew scattering from the position with the panicked speed of men who suddenly understood that no range was safe today. "South MG is disabled," Marcus said into the channel. "Move now, move." Donovan's voice came back immediately, tighter than before but present. "We're moving. 20 seconds to the south entrance." A pause, and through the static, Marcus could hear the controlled breathing of a man managing pain while maintaining operational function. "Tell Carter, tell her that was a hell of a shot." Marcus related. Emily was already back in her notebook recording the adjustment, updating her environmental data. She did not acknowledge the compliment with any visible emotion, but he saw her pen slow for just a moment, just a fraction of a second before resuming its steady movement across the page. That was Emily Carter's version of a smile. The next 40 minutes were the most compressed and the most expanded of Marcus's life simultaneously, the kind of time distortion that combat produces where each individual second is stretched to absolute clarity, while the total elapsed time collapses into something that feels like it could not possibly have taken as long as the clock insists it did. Alpha Team made the south entrance. They breached. There were contacts inside the compound. Kane's death had created confusion but not surrender, and the men he employed were professionals with enough training to continue fighting without their commander. Marcus called positions. He updated corridors. He tracked movement patterns at the compound exterior and fed them into the encrypted channel in the clipped efficient shorthand of a man who had done this enough times that the language was automatic. Emily stayed at the rifle, not firing, but maintaining her solution, updating her environmental data every 3 to 4 minutes with the same systematic attention she had brought to every training morning on the Virginia range. Twice during the breach and clear, Torres called for overwatch assessment on specific exterior positions. Marcus provided it. Once he had to tell them that a guard position they were planning to move past was not actually clear, that a second guard had relocated from the east face to cover the route, and that they needed to adjust. Torres acknowledged. They adjusted. The guard did not become a casualty that day because Marcus was watching, and because Emily's presence at that rifle position gave him the credibility on the channel that a pure reconnaissance asset would not have had. Nobody on Alpha Team that day was wondering whether Emily Carter belonged in an overwatch position. They were not thinking about that at all. They were thinking about the information coming through their earpieces and about the fact that a heavy machine gun that should have ended their mission was sitting broken and silent on a southeast corner, and about the man who had been directing that machine gun, who was currently not directing anything. At hour 6 of the operation, Torres came over the channel with the words that meant it was over. Over. Objective secured. Cache located. Donovan is ambulatory. We are moving to extraction. Overwatch, begin your own extraction when ready. Marcus sat back from the spotting scope and became aware for the first time since the ambush had detonated below them that his entire body was rigid with sustained tension. His neck ached. His hands were trembling, slightly not with fear, but with the release of adrenaline that had been standing at attention for the better part of 6 hours. He rolled his shoulders and heard his spine make a series of adjustments that sounded like a report from a distant range. He looked at Emily. She was still writing in the notebook, still recording data. She had not stopped maintaining her environmental log even after Torres called the all clear, because that was the way she worked, completely without truncation, without the shortcut of declaring the work finished before the process was actually complete. "It's done," Marcus said. "I know," she said. "Torres called all clear." "I heard him." "Emily." He waited until she looked up. "Are you all right?" She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all genuine questions, and he appreciated that about her. The refusal to give reflexive answers, the insistence on actually checking before she spoke. "Yes," she said, and then after a pause, "Are you—" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet. Ask me in about 12 hours. Something moved in her expression that might have been the closest she came to a laugh. "That's probably the most honest answer you have ever given me." "Probably," he agreed. They began their own extraction, which was its own particular kind of difficult, disassembling the Overwatch position, securing equipment, beginning the long route back to the designated exfil point, with the knowledge that while Kane was down and the compound was taken, the mountain itself did not care about any of that. and remained exactly as unforgiving as it had been when they climbed up. Marcus carried the bulk of the shared equipment. Emily carried her rifle and her kit bag, and the notebook which she tucked inside her jacket with the care you'd give something irreplaceable. It was during that extraction, about 90 minutes into the climb down, in the specific quality of post-operation quiet where the adrenaline is metabolized, but the processing has not yet begun, that Marcus asked the question he had been holding for 6 hours. "When you took the first shot," he said at Kane, "when the round was in the air." He paused. "What were you thinking during those 3 seconds?" Emily walked for a moment without answering. The terrain required attention, and she gave it the attention it required before she spoke. "I was thinking about whether I had correctly accounted for the Coriolis effect at that azimuth," she said. "The rotation adjustment at 2,100 yards in that direction from that latitude is about 4 inches. I had included it in the solution, but in the moment after firing, before the round reaches the target, the mind reviews the work. It's involuntary." 4 inches, Marcus said. "You were thinking about a 4-inch adjustment during the most important moment of the operation." "That 4 inches is the difference between the shot landing and the shot missing," she said simply. "There is no moment more appropriate to be thinking about it." He shook his head, but not dismissively, with something that was evolving in real time into a kind of awe. "Did you know when you squeezed the trigger, did you know it was going to hit?" She was quiet for several steps. "I knew the solution was sound. I knew the data supported it. I knew I had done everything that could be done with the preparation available." She paused. "Whether the shot hit or missed was the outcome of the work. I had done the work. What happened after was what happened." That's a very calm way to think about a shot that had every life below us riding on it. "The alternative is to think about the lives below you while you're squeezing the trigger," she said. "And if I think about the lives below me during the shot, my body responds to that thought. My heartbeat changes. My grip pressure changes. The trigger brake changes by fractions that matter at 2,100 yards." She looked at him sideways as they navigated a rocky section of the descent. "So I thought about 4 inches of Coriolis correction, because that's the thought that makes the shot land. The lives below you are the reason you're there. They are not the thought you think when you fire." Marcus did not respond to that for a long time. He was turning it over, examining it from different angles, the way you examine something that is simultaneously simple and profound, the kind of statement that is obvious once you hear it and impossible to arrive at on your own. They reached the exfil point 40 minutes ahead of the Alpha team's estimated arrival. Marcus established comms, confirmed extraction was on schedule, and then sat down with his back against a large rock and let the mountain wind do what mountain wind does, which was come from every direction at once and care about none of the things that had just happened. Emily sat nearby. She opened the notebook. He watched her write for a moment. "What are you recording now the mission is over?" "The mission is over," she agreed. "The data isn't." She did not look up. "The atmospheric data I collected today is the most complete mountain canyon wind profile I've ever built in a live environment. Every measurement, every variance, every pattern, this goes into the foundation for the next time. If there is a next time. If anyone ever needs to know how wind behaves in a canyon environment at this elevation and in these seasonal conditions." She paused. "Knowledge doesn't expire, Marcus. It compounds." He stared at her. He thought about Donovan somewhere below him on a mountain with fragmentation wounds in his left side moving toward extraction, with the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided 14 months ago that notebooks were the enemy and instinct was God, and who had today put his life and the lives of his team into the hands of a notebook and come out the other side breathing. I thought about Torres and Ramirez and the others, men who had laughed at the right times when Donovan was performing, who had maintained the comfortable consensus that Emily Carter was a curiosity at best and a liability at worst. Men who were alive today because that consensus had been wrong. I thought about himself, about the morning he had watched her make that shot at 2,000 yards on the Virginia range and called it lucky in the privacy of his own mind, even after he had seen the numbers, even after he had heard her explain the 2.4-second window. About the 14 months of careful distance he had maintained between fully believing in her and fully committing to that belief, the way you keep one foot on the dock when you board a boat you're not sure is seaworthy. The boat had crossed the ocean. He had been wrong to doubt it. Alpha team arrived at the exfil point 2 hours and 18 minutes after the all-clear call. Donovan was in the middle of the formation walking on his own, which Marcus had expected because Donovan would walk under his own power until he physically could not, and possibly a few minutes beyond that. His face was the color of old concrete, and his left side was wrapped with the compression, bandaging that tactical medics applied to shrapnel wounds in the field, temporary and inadequate, the kind of treatment that would need to be replaced properly within the next few hours. He saw Marcus first. He walked directly to him, which was also what Marcus had expected. "Two people down," Donovan said. It was his first sentence, not a greeting, a report. Petty Officer Daniels GSW to the upper arm stable. Petty Officer Kim blast fragmentation to both legs, serious but not critical. He'll keep both limbs. He paused. It could have been significantly worse. It would have been, Marcus said. Donovan held his gaze. Yes, it would have been. He said it flatly without the theatrical weight of a man making a speech. Just a statement of fact delivered by someone who had done the accounting and arrived at the correct number. Then he looked past Marcus to where Emily was sitting with her notebook. He stood there for a moment. Marcus watched him. He had known Jack Donovan for 4 years. He had seen him do things in the field that would not survive transcription to paper, things that required a particular kind of courage that most people never get close enough to danger to develop. He had seen him afraid in the honest biological sense, the sense that the body is afraid whether the mind consents to it or not. And he had seen him manage that fear with the controlled precision of a man who had made a permanent peace with his own mortality. He had never seen Donovan look the way he looked right now, standing at the edge of an exfil point on a cold mountain with fragmentation wounds in his side, looking at a woman writing in a notebook. Donovan walked over to her. His boots on the rocky ground were the only sound between them and the wind. Emily looked up when he reached her. He stood there for a moment. The silence was not awkward. It was the silence of something being assembled, carefully, one piece at a time, by a man who had not prepared remarks because he had not anticipated needing to make any. "Carter," he said. "Chief," she said. Another pause. "Daniels and Kim are alive because of that shot." He said it the way he said everything operational, direct, without decoration. "My team is alive because of that shot." Emily looked at him steadily. "Your team is alive because they executed the mission correctly under extremely difficult contact conditions," she said. "I provided supporting capability." Something shifted in Donovan's expression, a brief, involuntary thing, the kind of reaction that appears and disappears before the person experiencing it decides whether to allow it. He looked at the notebook in her hands. "How many pages have you filled?" She glanced down. "This is the 4th notebook for this deployment and preparation, plus what I collected today, which is another 12 pages. 4 notebooks." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Marcus had not expected and had not prepared himself to hear, something that landed with a specific weight in his chest, in the way that true things always carry more weight than performed ones. "I've been doing this wrong," Donovan said, not loudly, not as a confession to the assembled team, just to her in the direct and undecorated way that he delivered everything. "Not all of it, but the part where I thought the preparation had a ceiling, that there was a distance past which the preparation stopped mattering and the instinct took over. I was wrong about that distance." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "You weren't entirely wrong," she said. "Instinct kept your team moving in contact when there was no time to calculate anything. That's real. The preparation and the instinct work together. They're not competitors." Donovan absorbed that. He nodded once, the single nod of a man accepting a correction with the minimum necessary movement. Then he said, "Your notebook, the one you had at Kane's compound." He paused. "How did you know the window was 68 to 72 seconds? And Emily told him. She opened the notebook and showed him the wind pattern diagram, the time-stamped variance notations, the 2 hours of data collection that had preceded the shot. She explained the layering behavior, the canyon-specific phenomenon, the way the thermal currents from the valley floor interacted with the mountain crosswinds to create the cycling pattern. She explained it the way she explained everything, completely, without condescension, without the self-satisfaction of a person who has recently been proven correct. Just the data, the reasoning, the methodology. Donovan listened. He did not interrupt. He asked 2 questions, both of them specific and technical, both of them the questions of a man who was genuinely trying to understand rather than performing the appearance of interest. Emily answered both questions completely. Torres was standing nearby, close enough to hear. When Emily finished explaining, Torres turned to Ramirez and said in a voice pitched low enough to be private, but not quite quiet enough to be inaudible, "I feel like I've been watching this conversation coming for 14 months. Ramirez said nothing, but he nodded. Marcus was standing to the side of all of this, watching, and what he felt in that moment was something he would later struggle to describe accurately. Not quite pride, because he had not made the shot, had not built the solution, had not filled 4 notebooks with data that turned an impossible distance into a calculable problem. It was something adjacent to pride, something that had to do with having been close enough to the truth for long enough to recognize it when it finally stood up and declared itself in language that everyone could understand. The extraction helicopter arrived 40 minutes later. They loaded Kim and Daniels first, the way you always load the wounded first, and then the rest of the team boarded in sequence. Marcus was one of the last on. Emily was beside him. As the helicopter lifted from the exfil point and the mountain dropped away below them, Marcus looked out the side window at the canyon. 2,100 yards of open air. 3 wind layers moving in 3 different directions, a distance that every experienced professional in their community had agreed was beyond the practical engagement envelope of any human shooter. He thought about what Emily had said during their descent. Knowledge doesn't expire, it compounds. He looked at the notebook in her lap. She had it open, pen moving, recording the final data points of the day's environmental conditions with the same systematic attention she had given the first observation of the morning. The helicopter was noisy and cold, and the turbulence over the mountain peaks was significant enough that several operators had braced themselves against the airframe, and Emily Carter was writing, precisely and completely and without interruption. Donovan was seated across the helicopter. His wound managed his face still the color of old concrete, his eyes open and directed somewhere in the middle distance that Marcus recognized as the place people look when they are doing the accounting. The full accounting. Not just the tactical numbers, friendlies down, objectives, secured extraction, complete, but the other accounting. The one that runs underneath every operation and does not submit its final report until much later. At some point during the flight, Donovan's eyes moved to Emily. He watched her writing for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. Something passed between them. Not a conversation, not even a gesture, just the kind of mutual recognition that moves between people who have been through the same experience and arrived at the same understanding from different directions. Marcus had been right about her from the moment he had started watching, and he had not been brave enough to say so clearly, not until the proof was irrefutable. Donovan had been wrong about her from the beginning, and he had just been man enough to say so when the evidence demanded it. Both of those things were true. Both of them were going to have to live with exactly as much of that truth as they deserved. The helicopter crossed the mountain range and descended toward the temporary operating base, and the canyon disappeared behind them, and 2,100 yards became a number in a report, and a line in an after-action review, and an entry in Emily Carter's 4th notebook that would eventually be studied by people who needed to understand how wind behaves in canyon environments at that elevation in those seasonal conditions, and would use that understanding to calculate shots that had not yet been imagined. Knowledge compounds. The mission was over. The data would outlast all of them. But the night was not finished with what it needed to deliver. Because what happened when that helicopter touched down at the temporary operating base, in the cold and the dark, and the operational aftermath of the most significant mission any of them had run in years, was something that none of them had calculated for. Something that arrived without atmospheric data, without a preparatory window, without the 2 to 3 second alignment that made the impossible merely very, very difficult. The base commander met them at the landing pad. He was not a man who typically met teams at the landing pad. That was not his operational role, and it was unusual enough that Marcus registered it before he had even fully cleared the helicopter door. The commander said 4 words to Donovan. Marcus heard them clearly over the dying sound of the rotors. "We have a problem." Donovan looked at him. The wound in his left side, the exhaustion of 6 hours on a mountain, the weight of the full accounting he had been running during the flight, none of it left his face. The professional mask was back complete as if it had never been removed. "What kind of problem?" The commander glanced around at the assembled team, at Emily, back at Donovan. "The kind that requires a separate conversation," he said. "Now." Donovan looked at Marcus, then at Emily. His expression was unreadable in the way that truly controlled expressions are unreadable. not blank but deliberate, communicating nothing that its owner had not chosen to communicate. "Get everyone debriefed and processed," he said to Marcus. "I'll find you when I'm done." He followed the commander toward the main building, and Marcus watched him go, with the particular unease of an operator who has just completed an extraordinarily difficult mission and discovered that the difficulty was not yet finished. Beside him, Emily closed her notebook. "What do you think that is?" she asked. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. She was quiet for a moment. "The intelligence compromise," she said. "Kane knew our approach route. That means someone talked, or someone's communications were intercepted, or someone was feeding information to Kane's people from inside the planning chain." She paused. "That doesn't end when the mission ends." Marcus looked at her. She was right. Of course she was right. The mission had been built on intelligence that had been compromised at some point in its development, and Victor Kane was dead, and the compound was secured, and the chemical weapons were located. But the question of how Kane had known was still open, and open questions of that kind had consequences that extended beyond the operational timeline of the mission they were attached to. "You've been thinking about that," Marcus said. "Since the explosion in the riverbed," she said. "The positioning of the ambush was too precise for general preparation. He wasn't just covering possible approach routes. He had specific information about our specific route." She looked at him steadily. "Someone told him." The weight of that settled over the landing pad and over the assembled team and over the cold mountain night with the specific gravity of a truth that had been present the entire time and was only now being said aloud. Torres, standing nearby, had heard enough. He looked at Ramirez. Neither of them said anything. But the silence between them was thick with the same thing. The silence everywhere was thick with the recognition that the operation was over and the aftermath was just beginning, and that the aftermath might be longer and more complicated and more dangerous in its own way than anything that had happened on that mountain today. Marcus looked at Emily. She was looking at the building that Donovan had disappeared into her expression, carrying the same quality of focused attention that she brought to wind pattern analysis and temperature variance calculations and every other variable that had ever stood between a shot and its target. She was already measuring this new variable, already beginning the observation period, already preparing the foundation of the solution that the situation would eventually require. Whatever was in that building, whatever 4 words the commander had needed to say privately, whatever had compromised the intelligence and directed Kane's preparation toward their specific approach route, Emily Carter had been thinking about it since the explosion, and she was still thinking about it now. And the notebook in her hands was waiting for the data that would eventually tell the story completely. Because that was the thing about Emily Carter that Marcus understood now, 14 months after he had first watched her arrive at a Virginia range and begin writing numbers that nobody else believed would ever matter. She did not stop at the shot. She did not stop at the outcome. She did not stop at the after-action review or the debrief or the team's return to the base that had sent them. She stopped when the truth was complete. And right now, standing on a cold mountain landing pad with the wind coming from 3 directions and a commander delivering a private message to a wounded man with fragmentation in his side, the truth was very far from complete. She opened the notebook again. She began writing. The debrief room at the temporary operating base smelled like burned coffee and recycled air, and the specific kind of institutional exhaustion that accumulates in rooms where difficult conversations happen repeatedly over many years. Marcus had been in dozens of rooms like it. He had never sat in one feeling quite the way he felt now, not the post-mission relief that usually arrived when the team was back and the casualties were manageable and the objective was secured, something unresolved, something that the 4 words from the base commander had left sitting in the center of his chest like a stone that had not yet found the bottom. The debrief ran 2 hours, standard sequencing individual statements first, then collective reconstruction, then the tactical timeline assembled piece by piece with the kind of granular attention that the after-action process demanded. Marcus gave his account. Torres gave his. Ramirez, the others. Emily gave hers last, and she gave it with the same systematic completeness she brought to everything, moving through the timeline with precise timestamps and specific data points in the kind of detail that made the debrief officer a naval intelligence lieutenant named Carver, who had the energy of a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was running on professional obligation, sit forward in his chair at multiple points, and ask her to repeat herself. Say again the wind layer data, Carver said at one point. The three-layer analysis. Emily repeated it. Carver wrote it down with the focused attention of someone who understood in real time that he was hearing something operationally significant that went well beyond the scope of a standard after-action account. And this data was collected during the observation period prior to the engagement, Carver asked. Beginning approximately 2 hours before the engagement and continuing through the operational window, Emily said. Carver looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something additional in his notes, underlined it twice, and moved on. Marcus noticed the underlining. He filed it. Donovan was not in the debrief room. He was in the medical section, getting his wounds properly treated, which was where he should have been, and which he had almost certainly argued against in the 45-second window between the commander's 4 words and the practical necessity of the situation asserting itself. Donovan's relationship with medical care was the same as his relationship with everything that interrupted operational continuity, adversarial, and reluctant managed only when the alternative was genuinely worse. After the debrief, Carver asked Emily and Marcus to remain. He waited until the rest of the team had cleared the room. Then he closed the door, which was unusual, and set his notepad on the table and looked at them both with the expression of a man transitioning from one kind of conversation to a significantly different kind. I need to ask you both something that is not part of the standard debrief, he said. What I'm about to tell you is compartmented, and I need your acknowledgement before I continue. They acknowledged. Carver pulled a photograph from a folder that Marcus had not noticed him carrying. He set it on the table between them. It was a surveillance image drone footage frozen into a still frame, showing the compound's main exterior position from an oblique angle. In the image, Victor Kane was standing at the elevated walkway position, exactly as Marcus had described him. The timestamp in the corner of the image read 11 minutes before Emily had fired. This image was taken by our surveillance asset 11 minutes before the engagement, Carver said. I need you to tell me what you see. Marcus looked at the photograph. Kane at the exterior position, same as I described in my statement. Look at his right hand, Carver said. Marcus looked. Kane's right hand held the radio they had described. But there was something else, a document of some kind folded held against the radio with the same grip. We enhanced that image after you landed, Carver said. He set a second photograph on the table. The enhancement was imperfect but legible. The document was a map, and the map had markings on it, and the markings corresponded with a precision that made Marcus's stomach drop to approximately his boots to Alpha Team's exact insertion route. The silence in the room lasted a long time. He had the route, Marcus said. He had the route, Carver confirmed, marked on a physical document, which means the compromise was not a communications intercept. This was not a breach of our encrypted channels. This was human intelligence. Someone provided this document to Kane's network. Marcus looked at Emily. She was looking at the enhanced photograph with the expression he recognized from wind pattern, observation processing, cross-referencing, building a picture from data points that most people would not have thought to connect. When did you enhance this? She asked Carver. About 40 minutes before your helicopter landed. Who else has seen it? Carver paused. The pause itself was information. The base commander, myself, and now you two. Not the team, Emily said. Not yet. Another pause longer. Why us specifically? Marcus asked. Carver looked at him. Because the base commander's conversation with Chief Donovan was about this image. And because Chief Donovan, when informed of its existence, specifically requested that Emily Carter be included in the subsequent assessment. He paused again. His exact words were, and I'm quoting, she sees things the rest of us miss. The weight of that settled over the room. Marcus looked at Emily. Something moved in her expression. Brief carefully managed the kind of internal reaction she had trained herself to contain, but which occasionally, in moments of genuine surprise, broke the surface for a fraction of a second. She looked down at the photograph. The planning chain for our insertion route, she said. Who had access to the specific route selection? Carver said 6 names. 5 of them Marcus recognized immediately. The 6th was a name he had not heard before, a logistics coordinator attached to the operational planning cell. Someone outside the direct team structure, someone whose role placed them at the intersection of tactical planning and administrative function. Someone who would have had access to route selection documents without being part of the operational team. Emily was writing in the notebook. Carver watched her write. What are you recording? The 6 names and their access windows, she said, cross-referenced with what I know about the timeline of Kane's compound preparation. If Kane's people received the route document early enough to preposition the ambush charges, the transfer had to have occurred within a specific window. That window tells us which of the 6 names had both the access and the opportunity. Carver stared at her. Marcus recognized the expression. It was the same one that Chief Warrant Officer Briggs had worn on the qualification range in Virginia after Emily's 2,000-yard shot. The expression of a person who has just watched someone else do in 90 seconds what they had been struggling to do for hours. "We've been working on that timeline analysis since this morning," Carver said. "What conclusion have you reached?" Emily asked. Another pause. "Preliminary assessment points to the logistics coordinator." Emily looked up. "His name is Harmon, yes." She turned several pages in her notebook, not to a blank page, but to a page that was already filled with writing. She had written it during the extraction. Marcus realized this with a sensation in his chest that was approximately what he imagined it felt like to watch someone pick a lock with a hairpin. She had been working on this since the riverbed explosion, since the moment she had understood that the ambush was too precise, too targeted, too specifically positioned to be general preparation. "Harmon coordinated the logistics for the initial reconnaissance mission 3 weeks ago," she said. "He had access to the preliminary road assessment at that stage. Not the final selection, but the primary route was identified as the southwest dry riverbed in the preliminary assessment. The final planning only confirmed it." She looked at Carver. Kane's people did not need the final document. They needed the preliminary assessment. Harmon had that from the beginning. Carver was looking at her the way you look at something that is moving faster than your eyes are comfortable tracking. "You're saying the transfer happened 3 weeks ago." "I'm saying the opportunity existed 3 weeks ago, and the ambush preparation at the southwest riverbed is consistent with 3 weeks of positioning time. That is not the same as saying damn certain, but the data points in that direction." Carver picked up a secure phone from the table. He made a call that lasted 4 minutes, during which he said very little and listened a great deal, and at the end of which he set the phone down and looked at Emily with an expression that had moved past surprise into something that Marcus could only describe it as recalibration. The expression of a man updating a fundamental assumption. "Intelligence will want to talk to you," Carver said. "I know," Emily said, and she went back to writing. Donovan appeared in the doorway 30 minutes later, which meant he had spent exactly as little time in the medical section as was required to prevent his wound from becoming an immediate threat to his operational continuity. His left side was freshly wrapped, the compression visible under his shirt, and he moved with the controlled deliberateness of a man managing pain through sheer professional discipline. He looked at the photographs on the table. He looked at Carver. He looked at Emily's notebook. "She got there," he said, not a question. "She was there before us," Carver said. Donovan nodded. He sat down heavily in the chair across from Emily, and the heaviness of it was not just the wound. It was the weight of something accumulated over a long time that had finally reached the point where it could not be carried the same way anymore. He looked at her. "Carter," he said. She looked up. "Harmon," he said. "Most likely," she said. "The preliminary assessment window." "Yes." I was quiet for a moment, and Marcus watched him doing the same accounting that he had been doing on the helicopter, the full accounting, the one that runs underneath and takes longer to complete. "You worked this out during extraction," Donovan said. "I started working it out when the explosion happened in the riverbed," she said. "The precision of the positioning told me it was targeted intelligence, not general preparation. The rest was timeline analysis. While you were maintaining overwatch. It's not difficult to think about 2 things at once," she said, and something in her voice was so matter-of-fact about it, so free of any intention to impress, that it hit harder than any boast could have. Donovan looked at the table. He was quiet for long enough that Marcus started to wonder whether the blood loss had affected him more than it appeared. Then he said, "I owe you more than I said on the landing pad." Emily looked at him steadily. "You said what needed to be said." "I said what was adequate for the tactical moment. That's not the same thing." He looked up at her. "I spent 14 months making your life difficult in ways that were unprofessional and counterproductive, and which could have, in a different version of this mission on a different day, gotten people killed. If you had responded to what I did the way most people would have responded, you would not have been in that Overwatch position with 4 notebooks of data and a win solution that nobody else in this community could have built. He paused. I want you to know that I understand that completely. The room was very quiet. Marcus was aware of the weight of the moment with the full attention of someone who knew they were inside something that would not repeat. Something that was happening once in this form and then would become part of the permanent record of these people's lives and who they had been to each other. Emily was quiet for several seconds. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it always was, steady, direct, free of performance. I appreciate that, she said, but I need you to understand something in return. What I did on that ridge was not in spite of what you put me through. It was not a response to it. I prepared the way I prepared because that is how I prepare. The only variable your behavior changed was how comfortable I was while I was working. She paused. That matters, and it was wrong, and I accept your acknowledgement of it. But the preparation would have been the same. Donovan looked at her for a long moment. That might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me in a debrief room, he said. It's the accurate thing, she said. And she opened her notebook and went back to writing, which was her way of saying that the conversation was complete, and the next thing was the work. The intelligence assessment of Harmon took 72 hours. Marcus was not part of that process. It was above his access level and entirely within the domain of people whose job was specifically to find and understand what had happened. What he knew was that Emily was called in for 2 additional conversations during those 72 hours, and that each time she emerged from those conversations, she went directly to the notebook and wrote for a sustained period before allowing herself anything else. Whatever they were discussing, whatever they were building from the data she had provided, it required continued processing on her end. The observation period was not finished. On the second morning after the mission, Marcus found Torres in the common area with a cup of coffee and the 1,000-yard stare that was the universal currency of the post-operation period. Torres was a man who processed things through talking the opposite of Emily in almost every way, which was part of what made watching the two of them interact over the previous months so instructive. You know what I keep thinking about, Torres said when Marcus sat down across from him. What? The M-bomb position, Torres said. The second shot, when she hit the weapon itself. He shook his head. An 18-inch target at over 2,000 yards. Do you understand what that means physically? That is not a thing that is supposed to be possible. And yet, Marcus said, and yet, Torres agreed. He drank his coffee. I laughed at her notebook. You know that, right? I was right there with Donovan. Not as loud, but I laughed. I know. Does she know? Marcus thought about it. I think she registered everything that happened and filed it appropriately and has not spent a significant amount of time being angry about it. Torres considered that. Because she was right, and she knew she was right, and the opinion of people who were wrong wasn't a meaningful variable to her. Something like that. Torres was quiet for a moment. That's either the healthiest psychology I've ever encountered or the most frightening one. Both, Marcus said. It's always both with her. The Harmon investigation concluded on the 3rd day. Harmon had been removed from the base on the first morning, quiet professional, the kind of removal that happens without announcement and is explained only later, if at all, to the people who notice the absence. What Marcus learned through the particular informal channel that exists in every military unit between what is officially communicated and what is actually understood was that the preliminary assessment had confirmed Emily's timeline analysis. The transfer had occurred during the 3-week window she had identified. The preliminary route document had been the source. Harmon had provided it through a chain that connected eventually to Kane's network through 2 intermediaries. Whether Harmon had understood the full implications of what he was providing, whether he had known that the information would be used to position ambush charges that would kill or wound American operators was a question that the investigation was equipped to answer and that Marcus was not privy to. He suspected, based on what he knew about how people rationalize the things they did for money or ideology or coercion, that the answer was complicated and unsatisfying in the way that such answers always were. What he knew clearly was this: without Emily's shot at Kane, the ambush that Harmon had enabled would have trapped Alpha Team in the riverbed until an airstrike was the only option remaining. Without her analysis of the intelligence compromise, the investigation would have taken significantly longer to reach the conclusion that was now being acted upon. In both cases, the tactical problem and the intelligence problem, the solution had come from the same place, from the foundation that Emily Carter had been building, quietly and consistently, for as long as Marcus had known her. From the data, from the preparation, from the patience to do the work completely when everyone around her was satisfied with partial. On the morning of the fourth day, with the team preparing to begin the transit back to Virginia, Marcus found Emily at the equipment check with her rifle disassembled on the cleaning cloth, exactly as he had found her on the Virginia range 100 operational lifetimes ago. The notebook was beside the rifle, a new notebook. The fifth. She had started it the previous evening. He sat down nearby. He did not have anything specific to say. He just sat and she cleaned, and the comfortable quality of the silence between them was something that had been built over 14 months of early mornings and difficult conversations, in the accumulated weight of having watched someone do something that most people believed could not be done. "When we get back," he said eventually, "what happens?" "Same as always," she said. "Emily, after what happened on this mission, the intelligence analysis, things are going to be different." She looked up at him. "Different how?" "Carver mentioned at a briefing with Naval Intelligence. There's going to be documentation. The methodology, the atmospheric data, the wind profile work. People are going to want to understand how you built that solution." She was quiet for a moment. "That's fine," she said. "The methodology is documented. That's what the notebooks are for." "You're not bothered by that." "Why would I be if the methodology can be taught, if other people can learn to build more complete solutions at extreme range? That's the point. That's always been the point." She paused. "The shot isn't the point, Marcus. The shot is the output. The preparation is the point. If people take the methodology and use it and build on it and improve it, then what happened on that ridge generates value beyond this mission." She looked at him steadily. "That's what knowledge is for." He sat with that. Outside, he could hear the sounds of the base beginning the organized activity of a departure equipment, being staged, transport, being arranged, the bureaucratic machinery of moving people across the world resuming its necessary function. "There's going to be a commendation," he said. "Carver told me last night they're recommending you for the Naval Cross." The pen in Emily's hand slowed slightly, not stopped, slowed. "That's not necessary," she said. "It's not about necessary, it's about accurate. 2 shots at distances that have no precedent in confirmed naval special warfare engagements, plus intelligence analysis that accelerated the compromise investigation by an estimated 2 to 3 days. He paused. "Accurate." She was quiet for a moment. The pen resumed its normal pace. "The second shot was less precise than I would have liked," she said. "The impact point on the weapon was 3 inches from my intended point of aim." Marcus stared at her. "You're critiquing a shot that hit an 18-inch target at 2,000 yards. 3 inches of variance at 2,000 yards represents a calculation error that I need to identify and correct," she said without any particular emotion. "It was adequate for the operational requirement. It was not perfect. Perfect is what I'm working toward." And that was the moment, that precise moment, sitting beside a cleaning cloth, in a disassembled rifle and a 5th notebook filled with numbers. Watching Emily Carter identify a 3-inch variance at 2,000 yards as a problem to be solved, that was the moment when Marcus Webb understood completely and permanently what he had been watching for 14 months. Not a woman trying to prove something. Not a person fighting for acceptance or recognition or the validation of people who had dismissed her. Someone who was working toward a standard that existed in absolute terms, independent of what anyone around her believed or said or laughed about or acknowledged. The standard was perfect. The work was the process of approaching it. Everything else, the ridicule, the commendation, the debrief, the intelligence briefings, even the shot itself was context. The work was the thing. Donovan appeared in the equipment room doorway. His movement was still managed carefully against the wound, but his face had returned to its normal operational baseline, present, alert, controlled. He looked at Emily's disassembled rifle, then at the notebook. "Carter," he said. She looked up. "When we get back to Virginia," he paused, "I want to restructure Overwatch preparation protocols for the team. Incorporate your methodology into the standard training cycle." He said it with the directness he brought to all operational decisions. No preamble, no excessive explanation. Just the decision stated as the fact it had become. "That means I need you to lead the development of the curriculum, working with Briggs and the range team." Emily looked at him for a moment. "That's a significant change to the existing protocol." Yes, he said, some people won't like it. Some people didn't like what you did on that ridge either, he said. The machine gun position doesn't care what they think. Something moved in Emily's expression. The thing that functioned as a smile. When do you want to start? Soon as we're back and you've had adequate rest, which for you I'm estimating will be approximately 6 hours before you're back at the range, whether I've authorized it or not. She looked back down at the rifle. 8, she said. I need 8 hours. Donovan made a sound that was unmistakably a short laugh. Marcus had heard that sound from Donovan perhaps twice in 4 years. The unexpectedness of it, in this context, in this room, from this man in this moment, made it one of the most genuinely surprising things he had experienced in a week that had contained an ambush, an impossible shot, an intelligence compromise, and a formal commendation recommendation. Donovan shook his head once, almost imperceptibly, and walked away toward the staging area. Torres appeared in the doorway a moment after Donovan left, as if he had been waiting for the corridor to clear. He stood there for a moment, looking at Emily with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is now deciding whether the rehearsal was adequate. Hey, Carter, he said. She looked up. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 3 days, and I haven't come up with anything better than just saying it. He paused. I'm sorry for the laughing, for all of it. He held her gaze. You were right the entire time, and we were wrong the entire time, and I'm sorry. Emily looked at him steadily. How many times have you been in a contact situation that required a solution outside your instinctive range? She asked. Torres frowned slightly. I don't know. A few. Think about the specific ones, he thought. Twice, maybe 3 times, where the distance or conditions were at the edge of my capability. What happened? A pause. We managed, mostly. Once we had to pull back from an objective because we didn't have the engagement capability. What would a more complete preparation methodology have changed in those situations? Torres was quiet for a long moment. He was the kind of man who, when actually thinking, did it visibly. His face carried the process. Maybe nothing, he said. Maybe everything. The one where we pulled back, maybe we don't pull back. Maybe we take the shot and the objective is secured. He paused. I don't know. That's the honest answer, Emily said. I don't know either for those specific situations. What I know is that the preparation gives you the capability. Whether the capability changes the outcome depends on the day. She looked at him directly. But having the capability is always better than not having it. That's not debatable. Torres nodded, slowly, the nod of a man arriving at a conclusion he had been approaching for a long time and had finally reached the edge of. No, he said, that's not debatable. He looked at the notebook. Can I ask you something? Yes. The window, the 68 to 72 second alignment. If it had not come, if the layers had not aligned, what would you have done? Emily was quiet for a moment. I would have waited longer, she said. And if it still did not come, I would have called it and supported the mission through whatever capability was available. You would have accepted not taking the shot. If the solution wasn't sound, yes. A shot that misses at 2,100 yards in a live engagement is not a neutral event. It burns the position, burns the time, and potentially burns the mission. I would not have fired without a valid solution. She paused. The team's survival was not a reason to take a bad shot. It was a reason to build a good one. Torres absorbed that. He stood in the doorway for another moment, processing. Then he said simply, see you at the staging area, and walked away. Marcus watched him go. Then he looked back at Emily. She had returned to the rifle, the final assembly. The component checks, the sequence she had clearly executed thousands of times. Her hands moved with the automatic precision of mastery. Her eyes were on the work. You know what Donovan said is going to change things, Marcus said. The curriculum, the protocol changes. That's going to be your name on it. It's going to be the methodology on it, she said. The name is incidental. Emily, he waited until she looked up. You're allowed to acknowledge what you've done. She looked at him for a long moment. The notebook was on the table between them, filled both of them aware of what it contained, not just the atmospheric data and the ballistic solutions in the wind pattern analysis, but the implicit record of every early morning on a Virginia range that nobody else had shown up for, every page filled while other people were sleeping, every variable calculated while other people were deciding that the distance was beyond practical engagement. I know what I've done, she said quietly. And there was something in those 5 words that was not pride exactly, but was in the same territory. The steady, grounded recognition of someone who has measured the distance between who they were and what they attempted and found that the distance, while enormous, was not insurmountable. I've been building toward it for a long time. Since before you got to us, Marcus said. Long before, she said. She picked up the rifle. She checked the assembly one final time. She set it in the case and closed the latches with the quiet finality of something completed. Then she picked up the notebook, the fifth one, and tucked it into her kit bag with the careful precision she always used. The staging area was calling them. The transit back to Virginia was waiting. The team that had arrived at this mountain depleted and compromised and uncertain was going home different. Not without wounds, not without the weight of what had happened, but different in a way that would compound forward through every mission and every training morning and every page of every notebook that came after this one. Emily shouldered her kit bag. She picked up the rifle case. She walked toward the door and Marcus fell into step beside her, and they moved through the hallway toward the staging area together, and the fifth notebook was in her bag, and the pen was in her pocket, and the next observation period was already beginning in the back of her mind, because the work did not stop when the mission ended. The work was always the thing, and for Emily Carter, it always would be. The flight back to Virginia took 19 hours across 3 transport configurations, and Marcus spent most of it watching the team sleep in the particular collapsed way that operators sleep after a mission. Not peacefully, not deeply, but with the complete physical surrender of bodies that have used everything they had and require unconditional restoration before they can function again. Torres was out within 20 minutes of boarding the first transport. Ramirez lasted longer fighting it the way he always did before his chin dropped and his breathing changed, and the mission finally released its grip on his conscious mind. Emily did not sleep. Marcus had expected this the same way he had come to expect everything about her that was different from everyone else around her. Not with surprise, but with the quiet recognition of a pattern that had been consistent for as long as he had known her. She sat with the fifth notebook open across her knees, and she wrote in it for the first 4 hours of the transit. Not frantically, not with the urgency of someone trying to outrun a deadline, with the steady, unhurried pace of someone doing necessary work at the appropriate time, because the appropriate time was now and the work was necessary. He watched her for a while without speaking. Then he said quietly enough not to wake Torres, "You should sleep." "I know," she said without looking up, "but you're not going to." "Not yet," she turned a page. "The Coriolis data from the second shot needs to be reconciled against the primary solution baseline. If I don't do it while the conditions are current in my memory, I lose precision in the record." "The 3-inch variance," he said. "Yes." She wrote something. "I've identified the most likely source. The far wind layer shifted approximately 1.5 knots between my last observation and the moment of fire. I was tracking it at 8 knots consistent for 20 minutes. The shift was within the margin I had accepted as stable. It should not have been accepted as stable at that duration without a recheck." Marcus absorbed that. "You're saying you made an error." "I'm saying I made an assumption that was inadequately supported by the observation window available," she said. "In the operational context, the result was acceptable. In terms of what the preparation should have produced, the variance represents a correctable gap in the methodology. Emily, you hit an 18-inch target at 2,000 yards in a live engagement. And I should have hit the center of it," she said. And she said it with complete equanimity, without self-punishment, without the exaggerated standards of someone who needed imperfection to justify self-criticism. Just a professional assessment of a professional result against a professional standard. 3 inches at that range is correctable. I want to correct it. He did not argue with her. He had learned over 14 months exactly which of Emily Carter's positions were worth engaging and which were simply the shape of who she was. The standard she held herself to was not negotiable because it was not a performance of high standards. It was the actual standard she worked within, the one that had produced 4.5 notebooks of data and a shot that had no precedent in their community's documented history. You did not argue someone out of the methodology that had just saved 8 lives. You paid attention to it. He slept eventually. When he woke, Emily was asleep in her seat with the notebook closed on her lap and her pen still in her hand, and the sight of it was so precisely her, so completely the image of a person whose last conscious act before surrendering to sleep was completing the record that Marcus sat with it for a moment before looking away. There was something in it that felt private, not in a way that required distance, but in the way that genuine things always have a quality that makes you careful about how you look at them. They landed at Virginia Beach in the early morning, and the base received them the way it always received returning teams, with the specific institutional efficiency of a place that processed people coming and going constantly and had developed systems for it that were effective precisely because they were impersonal. Equipment logged, medical assessments completed, the formal administrative machinery of return engaging with the quiet grinding competence of a bureaucracy that had been doing this for decades. Donovan was processed through medical first, which he accepted this time, without the argument that Marcus had expected, and Marcus understood that the wound was more significant than Donovan had allowed to show on the mountain. The controlled movement, the careful management of his left side throughout the transit, that was not stoicism for its own sake. That was a man operating at the edge of what his body could sustain through professional discipline alone. Marcus was told through the same informal channel that had informed him about Harmon that the wound would require a 6-week recovery period, and that Donovan had responded to this information by requesting clarification on whether the 6 weeks was a hard requirement or a guideline, and had been told firmly that it was a requirement, and had said nothing further, which was the loudest possible expression of his feelings on the subject. The formal debrief at the Virginia base happened 48 hours after return. It was longer than the field debrief, more people, more levels of command, more institutional weight in the room. Admiral Reyes was present, which was unusual enough to be a statement in itself. Captain Holloway, who had run their range mornings and watched Emily's first qualification and written something in his notebook after her 2,000-yard shot, was present. Lieutenant Carver had flown back with them and was present, and 6 people from Naval Intelligence that Marcus did not know and was not introduced to by name were present. Emily gave her account for the 3rd time. She gave it the same way she had given it the previous 2 times, completely, with precise timestamps and specific data and the kind of technical detail that required the room to stay with her or fall behind, and most of the room stayed with her. The Naval Intelligence people asked questions that were different from the questions the operational debrief had generated, less tactical, more structural. They were interested in the methodology, in the 4.5 notebooks, in the atmospheric modeling approach, and how it had been developed, and whether it was documented in a form that could be transferred. Emily told them it was documented. She told them it was in the notebooks. She told them that the notebooks were available for review and that she was willing to work with whoever needed to understand the methodology to translate it into a format appropriate for training purposes. Admiral Reyes, who had said very little during the technical portion, spoke toward the end. He was a man who had the quality that Marcus associated with people who had achieved significant things, the quality of not needing to perform authority, because the authority was simply present in the same way that a load-bearing wall does not need to announce itself. Petty Officer Carter, he said, I've been in naval special warfare for 31 years. I want you to tell me something honestly. Emily looked at him. Yes, sir. When you established the Overwatch position and began your observation period, before the ambush, before any of the contact, did you intend to engage at that range if a target presented? The room was very quiet. Everyone in it understood that this question had a correct professional answer and a true answer, and that those 2 answers were not necessarily the same answer, and that what Admiral Reyes was asking for was the true one. Emily was quiet for a moment, then she said, Yes, sir. I intended to engage if a target presented and if I had a valid solution, despite the mission designation being reconnaissance. The mission designation was reconnaissance with a contingency engagement role. I took the contingency seriously. Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because contingencies exist for a reason, she said. And because I had looked at the terrain and the conditions in the distance and concluded that if the contingency was needed, preparation was the difference between the shot being possible and the shot being impossible. I prepared for possibility. Another pause. At what point did you conclude you had a valid solution? Approximately 4 minutes before the ambush detonation, she said. I had built the solution during the observation period. The wind alignment window had been identified. The solution was ready. So you had the shot before you knew you needed it? Yes, sir. Reyes leaned back slightly. It was a small movement, but Marcus read it clearly. the movement of a man who has received an answer that has confirmed something he was working toward. That, he said, is preparation. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The formal commendation ceremony happened 10 days after their return. The Naval Cross, the second highest honor in the United States Navy, was presented to Emily Carter in a ceremony that was attended by the team, by Admiral Reyes, by Captain Holloway, and by a small number of other personnel whose presence indicated the level at which the mission's outcome had been recognized. Donovan was present in a chair because his wound had not yet permitted him to stand for extended periods, a fact that he had clearly communicated his feelings about to anyone within conversational range, but which the medical staff had declined to negotiate on. Marcus stood in the formation and watched the medal being pinned and felt the weight of the moment in the way that genuine moments of recognition carry weight. Not the ceremonial weight of the occasion, but the specific gravity of knowing exactly what the recognition represented and what it had cost to earn it. 14 months of early mornings, 4.5 notebooks, a 2,000-yard shot in the Virginia qualification that everyone except Briggs had tried to explain away. Every page filled while the people around her decided the distance was too great and the math was too slow and the instinct was enough. The instinct had not been enough. The math had been enough. And now there was a medal and there was the record and there was the methodology that the naval intelligence people were already working with Emily to document in transferable form. And there was a curriculum being developed under her guidance that would eventually change the preparation standards for Overwatch positions across naval special warfare. After the ceremony, when the formal portion was concluded and the institutional weight of it had dispersed into the informal gathering that always followed these events, Marcus found himself standing near the armory with Torres and Ramirez watching Emily across the room. She was talking to Admiral Reyes and Captain Holloway with the same quality of direct, undecorated communication that she brought to every conversation. No social performance, no adjustment for the rank in front of her, just the information and the methodology and the truth of what had been done and how. She looks the same, Torres said. She is the same, Marcus said. That's what I mean. Torres watched her for a moment. Everything around her has changed. The medal, the commendation, Donovan completely reversing his position, the curriculum project, everything. And she looks exactly the same as she did the first morning she walked onto that range with her kit bag and her notebook. Because she was never trying to change anything, Ramirez said, and it was the first time Ramirez had offered an unsolicited analysis of Emily Carter in Marcus's memory. Ramirez was a man of few interpretive words, tactical assessments, yes, but this kind of psychological observation was outside his normal operational range. The fact that he offered it indicated something about the depth of what the mission had moved in him. She wasn't trying to prove something to us. She was just doing the work. We changed. She stayed the same. Marcus looked at him. That's exactly right, he said. Ramirez shrugged. Took me long enough to see it. Took all of us long enough, Torres said. Donovan materialized beside them, moving with the careful deliberateness of his recovery, holding a cup of coffee that Marcus suspected was the latest in a very long series of cups consumed that day. He stood beside Marcus and looked across the room at Emily in conversation with the Admiral. She's telling him about the Coriolis correction, Donovan said. Marcus glanced at him. How do you know? Because she told me about it yesterday and she drew a diagram and it took 45 minutes and at the end of it I understood something about ballistic physics that I did not understand before, which is not something I say lightly. He drank his coffee. The 3-inch variance. She considers it a correctable error. I know, Marcus said. She's right to consider it that, Donovan said. And then he was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the quiet was the kind that Marcus had learned to respect Donovan, working through something, assembling it, getting it right before he said it. I've been thinking about what she said in the debrief room, at the base, about the preparation being the same regardless of my behavior. What about it? She was right that the preparation would have been the same, but I've been thinking about what would have been different. He paused. If I had engaged with her methodology from the beginning, if I had taken it seriously and worked with it rather than against it, what would the team's collective capability look like right now? Not just her capability, all of ours. He looked at the coffee in his hand. 14 months of collective development that we don't have because I decided her approach was wrong before I understood it. That is the actual cost of what I did, not to her, to the team, to the mission capability. The honesty of it landed in the silence between them, not self-flagellation. Donovan was constitutionally incapable of self-flagellation. It was too close to self-indulgence, and self-indulgence was not part of his operational vocabulary. This was something more useful than self-flagellation. This was accurate accounting. The full accounting finally completed. The curriculum will recover some of it, Marcus said. Some, Donovan agreed. Not all. You can't recover time. He paused. That's the thing about preparation. You can't do it retroactively. You can only do it before. Marcus looked at him. In 4 years of knowing Jack Donovan, he had heard the man say many things that were true in the operational sense. Things about cover and movement and threat assessment and the management of fear under fire. He had heard him be wrong with authority and right with authority in roughly equal measure, which was about the average for men of his experience and confidence. He had never heard him say something that sounded quite as much like wisdom. You're going to be a different kind of team leader after this, Marcus said. Donovan looked at him with an expression that was almost amused. Almost. Don't make it sound like a transformation scene in a movie web. I'm not, Marcus said. I'm just saying what's accurate. Donovan made a sound that acknowledged the point without committing to an emotional response, which was the closest he was likely to get to agreement on the subject of his own personal growth, and Marcus accepted it as what it was. 2 weeks after the commendation ceremony, the first session of the new Overwatch preparation curriculum run on the Virginia range. Emily led it, Briggs assisted. 8 operators from 2 different teams attended, men who had been selected based on their existing long-range qualification scores and their assessed aptitude for the kind of systematic data-intensive preparation that the methodology required. Marcus attended as an observer. He sat to the side of the range in the position he had occupied on so many early mornings over the previous 14 months, and he watched Emily explain the wind layer observation protocol to 8 men who were listening with the focused attention of professionals who had been told through official channels and informal ones that what they were about to learn had been the deciding factor in the outcome of an operation that most of them already knew about in broad terms. She started with the notebook. This is where it begins, she said, holding it up. Not her current notebook, a blank one issued to each of the 8 attendees along with their training materials. Everything else builds from what goes in here. The observation period is not preliminary to the preparation. The observation period is the preparation. If you shortcut the observation, you corrupt everything that follows. One of the attendees, a young petty officer named Garrett, who had the rangy, coiled energy of someone in his first years of real operational deployment, raised his hand. How long does the observation period take? As long as the conditions require, Emily said. Garrett frowned slightly. Can you give us a number, like minimum? No, she said, and then registering the genuine operational concern behind the question rather than its surface bluntness. I can tell you that in stable conditions at moderate range, a thorough observation can be completed in 20 to 30 minutes. In active conditions at extreme range, it can take 2 hours or more. The conditions set the requirement. You don't set a timer and declare the observation complete when it expires. You observe until you have what you need to build a valid solution. Garrett absorbed that. What if you don't have 2 hours? Then you build the most complete solution possible in the time available. You quantify the uncertainty in your solution explicitly, and you make an informed decision about whether to engage based on that uncertainty. She looked at him directly. A partial solution is not the same as no solution, but it is also not the same as a complete one. Knowing the difference is the skill. Garrett nodded, slowly, with the specific quality of a person receiving information that is simultaneously simple and more demanding than they had anticipated. Marcus watched the session run for 3 hours. He watched Emily move through the methodology with the same systematic completeness she brought to everything, building from observation to data collection to calculation to solution development, never skipping steps, never allowing the trainees to treat any component as preliminary in the dismissive sense. He watched 8 men who had arrived at the range with the confident baseline of experienced operators begin the process of discovering that their confidence, while earned, was confidence in a partial picture, that the picture had more in it than they had been seeing, that the additional content of the picture was accessible through work, through patience and data, and the willingness to maintain an observation period beyond the point where it felt like the useful information had already been gathered. He watched the moment that it clicked for Garrett. It happened about 90 minutes into the session during the first practical exercise. Garrett had been observing a reference point on the range recording wind data in his new notebook with the self-conscious care of a man using an unfamiliar tool. At some point, his pen slowed and his head came up, and he looked at the range with an expression that was different from the expression he had arrived with. Not dramatically different, but genuinely different in the way that seeing something for the first time changes the shape of your face slightly before you've had time to process it. He saw the wind layers, not intellectually operationally. He saw them as separate, distinct phenomena rather than as a single environmental condition called wind. He saw the near layer moving differently from the mid-range layer. He saw the relationship between them. He started writing faster. Emily saw it too. Marcus watched her notice, and he watched her deliberately not make a production of it, not draw attention to Garrett's moment, not turn it into a teaching illustration for the group. She just continued the session and allowed Garrett his private rearrangement, and that restraint was its own kind of instruction in how you treat the moments when people learn things that matter. After the session, Marcus walked over to Garrett while the trainees were packing up. "How was it?" he asked. Garrett looked up. "Different than I expected," he said. "Different how?" Garrett thought about it with the genuine effort of a man who wanted to say the accurate thing rather than the convenient one. "I thought it was going to be about technique, like a better technique for calculating wind drift. More precise adjustments, more accurate corrections." He paused. "It's not about technique. The technique is the same. It's about how much data you feed into it. It's about building the picture more completely before you try to use it." He looked at the notebook in his hands. "I've been shooting with a partial picture my whole career and thinking it was the full picture." "Yeah," Marcus said. "Me too." Garrett looked at him. "You were her spotter." "On the mission, yes." "What was it like actually being there when she took those shots?" Marcus thought about the spotting scope, about the 3 seconds of travel time, about the empty walkway where Kane had been standing, about the broken machine gun on the southeast corner with the crew scrambling away from it. He thought about the way Emily had looked after the first shot, still behind the rifle, still in position, already recording the outcome, with the same attention she had given the preparation. "Quiet," what he said, and then, because that was inadequate, she made the impossible seem like the natural result of everything that came before it. "That's the best I can describe it." Garrett nodded slowly. He looked at the notebook again. "I'm going to fill this thing," he said, and the certainty in it was genuine, not bravado, not the performed commitment of someone making a public declaration, but the quiet resolve of a person who has seen something true and made the private decision to pursue it. "Start tomorrow mornings," Marcus said. "She'll be here at 0530. Garrett looked at him. "You're serious?" "She's always here at 0530. The understanding in Garrett's expression was the understanding of someone revising an assumption. "Before anyone else." "Before anyone else," Marcus confirmed. "She's been here before anyone else since the first day she arrived. That hasn't changed." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his kit bag and his notebook and walked toward the parking area with the particular purposefulness of someone who had somewhere to be in the morning and had already started preparing for it in their mind. Marcus watched him go. Then he turned toward the range. Emily was still there. Of course she was still there. The trainees had gone. Briggs had packed up his materials and exchanged a few words with her and left. The range was emptying in the late afternoon with the ordinary human efficiency of people at the end of a working day, and Emily Carter was standing at the 7-lane position where she had stood on her first morning at this base, and she was observing the wind patterns on the range with her notebook open and her pen moving. Marcus walked over. He did not say anything when he reached her. He stood beside her and looked out at the range the way she was looking at it, and he tried to see what she saw, the layers, the differentiation, the specific quality of each current of moving air, distinguishing itself from the others in the data available to patient attention. After a while, he said, "What are you seeing?" "The afternoon thermal is collapsing," she said. "When the surface temperature drops below the ambient by about 2 degrees, the near layer is going to stabilize significantly. The mid-range layer will take another 20 minutes after that. By 1800, the range is going to be extremely clean." He looked at the range. He could not see what she was describing, but he believed it. "Are you going to shoot?" "I was thinking about it," she said. He looked at the rifle case beside her. "The 3-inch variants." "Yes." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. He set down his own bag. He sat on the bench nearby with the ease of someone who had done this many times in many weather conditions and was comfortable with all of them. Then I'll spot. She looked at him. Something in her expression had the quality of genuine warmth, not the performed warmth of social convention, but the real thing, which is always quieter and more specific than the performed version. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. She went back to her observation. The pen moved, the notebook filled, the afternoon thermal collapsed the way she had said it would, in the timeline she had described, and the near layer stabilized, and Marcus watched the range become something different from what it had been 20 minutes earlier. Cleaner, more readable, the kind of conditions that created the possibility she had been waiting for. At 1800 approximately, she picked up the rifle. The target was at 2,000 yards. Not 2,100, the range did not extend that far. 2,000 yards, which was the maximum available, which was the distance at which she had made the qualification shot that had started everything, which was the distance at which Donovan had said her results were lucky, and she had told him precisely and without anger that she had adjusted 3/4 of a mil right and the shot was not lucky. She established her position. She opened the notebook to the current page. She studied it for 12 seconds. She closed it and set it aside. The conditions were clean, the layers were aligned, the picture was complete. She fired. Marcus had the spotting scope. He tracked the round through the air, 3 seconds of travel time, 3 seconds of the bullet, doing exactly what the physics and the preparation and the data and the methodology said it would do, crossing the distance between the rifle and the target through air that had been measured and understood and accounted for with the completeness that 14 months of work had produced. It hit dead center, not within 3 inches of center, not within 1 inch of center, dead center with the precision that 2,000 yards of clean air in a complete firing solution in 14 months of uninterrupted preparation produced when they were assembled correctly. Marcus looked up from the spotting scope. Dead center, he said. Emily was already writing in the notebook, recording the conditions, the solution, the outcome, the variance from intended point of aim. She wrote for about 90 seconds. Then she capped the pen and set it down. Good, she said. Not triumphant, not relieved, just the quiet, grounded acknowledgement of work that had reached the standard it was always reaching toward. The Coriolis correction was right. The methodology was sound. The 3-inch variance had been identified, analyzed, corrected, and eliminated. She picked up her rifle. She began breaking it down for cleaning. With the sequence, she had always used the automatic precision of a person who had done this enough times that it no longer required conscious attention, freeing the conscious mind for the next thing and the thing after that and the work that was always continuing. Marcus watched her for a moment. He thought about the first morning, about her walking through the gate with her kit bag and her rifle case and her notebook, and the way Donovan had stopped mid-sentence and the way the silence had rolled through the assembled team like a wave. He thought about every early morning since then, every page of every notebook, every moment of ridicule that she had received and processed and filed under a category labeled irrelevant and moved past without breaking stride. I thought about 8 operators sitting on a Virginia range with blank notebooks in their hands, learning to see the wind layers. He thought about Garrett's expression when it clicked. He thought about the curriculum documentation sitting in Naval Intelligence files and the after-action report with its unprecedented engagement distance and the Naval Cross that had been pinned to her uniform in a ceremony that Admiral Reyes had attended personally in the compound in the mountains of a country Marcus would not name, where the chemical weapons were being secured and the distribution network was being dismantled, and the ambush charges that Harmon's intelligence had helped position were being cataloged as evidence. I thought about the woman who had done the math when everyone else said the math was the wrong tool, who had done the observation when everyone else said the observation was unnecessary, who had sat in the ridicule for 14 months without moving an inch from who she was or what she knew or how she worked, because the work was the thing and the work did not require the approval of the people observing it to be valid. Emily Carter picked up the clean rifle, reassembled it, checked it, and set it in the case. She picked up the notebook. She tucked it into her kit bag with the care she always used. She shouldered the bag and picked up the rifle case and stood in the gathering dark of the Virginia evening, exactly as she had stood on the first morning, unhurried, complete, carrying everything she needed. Same time tomorrow, Marcus asked. She looked at him. the expression that functioned as a smile. "I'll be here at 0530, she said. "I know you will," he said. She walked off the range. Her boots on the asphalt were steady, and even the same pace she had maintained across 14 months of early mornings in one mountain in Eastern Europe, in a canyon that nobody else had believed a bullet could cross. The rifle case was in her right hand, the kit bag was over her left shoulder, the notebook was inside the bag. The range was empty behind her. The notebook was full, and somewhere in the Naval Special Warfare Training System, 8 blank notebooks were waiting on 8 desks for 8 men who had spent the afternoon learning that the picture had more in it than they had been seeing, and that the additional content was there for anyone patient enough to observe it completely, and that the distance between what was possible and what was believed to be possible was exactly the distance of the preparation you were willing to do before the moment of truth arrived. Emily Carter had always known that distance. She had measured it precisely and completely in the only unit that ever mattered, 1 page at a time.